Matt, this weekend, really big pay-per-view coming at us from Fight Island. If you can believe it, the UFC is going back to Abu Dhabi. And of course, we have the two title fights up at the top. Jan Blachowicz taking on Dominick Reyes. You also have Israel Adesanya looking to defend his middleweight title against none other than the eraser Paulo Costa. And Matt, first fight on our prelim card, we have the former M1 Global light heavyweight champion Khadis Ibragimov, and he's finally looking to get that elusive UFC win. It's evaded him in his first three bouts so far, and he's taking on a bit of an unknown in Danilo Marques. And Matt, this is a really interesting fight because Khadis Ibragimov, we know how good he was overseas in Russia. He was just win, win, win. I know, what was it, 3 fights before he came into the UFC, he did win a fight due to illegal fence grabs from his opponent, Giga Kukashvili.
Never a great sign.
Never all that good, but he did have a very tidy record over with the promotion, and he looked to be one of those next big things at light heavyweight in the UFC. It just hasn't translated for him. I mean, you look at him. He loses at Dawodu in his UFC debut, gets finished, then he loses a decision to, I mean, Father Time hates this guy, but Ed Herman, it's tough to get a win over Ed Herman. Ask Mike Rodriguez. That was a tough one. And then Khadis Ibragimov goes out in his last fight, and he's taken on Roman Dolidze. And it was another one of those head scratches of an opponent because Dolidze had been out for a really long time. You look at the performances that he put on the regional scene over in Europe, and he looked amazing. And he comes out and looks amazing. So for Khadis Ibragimov, he just really hasn't been able to get things going so far in his UFC tenure. His opponent, huge wild card. We're looking over at Danilo Marques, 34 years old. He hasn't fought in about 2 years and 7 months. That's never a good sign. He's a guy that spent time cornering Shogun Rua, trains with Fabrizio Verdum at King's MMA. He spent time training at Vila de Luta in Brazil, which is Damian Maia's gym. He's a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt under Rafael Cordeiro. You know how good and, I guess, accomplished he is in terms of jiu-jitsu. If you watch some of his fights, and there's, I would say, limited fight tape. He's one of the harder guys to find tape on, but you can find it if you're, creeping around MMA Core. If you look over on Facebook and some of the older YouTube videos, he's one of those guys that kind of stands a little square, moves in, closes the gap, tries to take the fight to the ground. And if he can get on top of you, he's going to try and take the back. He's going to land some heavy strikes. It's tough to try and tell, again, like I said, what you're going to get, because this is a guy, he's billed as 6'6", fought at middleweight in the past, going to really take charge at 205 pounds.
Oh, yeah.
This is a guy, though, that I look at, and the upside is definitely with Khadis Ibragimov. I mean, this seems like one of those fights where they're just throwing a guy in there for him to face. And if Ibragimov wins, well, then there you go. You get that big UFC win that you were finally searching for. If not, probably see you later. But I mean, hey, they booked Daquan Townsend in a fight here coming up soon with the UFC. So they're not willing to totally get rid of guys. But Danilo Marques, it's one of those ones where, again, you're buddies with Fabrizio Verdum. You've cornered Shogun Rua. You're buddies with Damian Maia. So they bring him in. It's a good opportunity for him. But the other thing that I want to say before I hand it off to you, if you look at Danilo Marques' last 2 wins, he beat Clayton Caetano, who was 5-4-1 at the time. He started his career off as 5-1 with a draw, 5-0 with a draw. And Danilo Marques was his 5th loss in a row. If you look at his opponent before that, Mark Polimeno, Mark was 0-16 going into that fight. So Danilo Marques, when he's fought the good competition, i.e. Myron Dennis, that you might recognize from The Ultimate Fighter, he was losing that fight. Mind you, it was a split decision loss, but that fight was a very long time ago. We're going back 3 years, 5 months, that split decision loss at LFA 9, which is actually a really good card. So go back and watch it. But this guy's such a question mark. Even from watching the fight tape, it's hard to tell what you're going to get. Regardless of a pick here, this to me is a fade all day.
Okay, thank you. Because I was just about to say, you're giving Danilo Marques a really hard time, but you're acting like Khadis Ibragimov hasn't given you any reason to not be concerned about his UFC career up to this point. I mean, 0-3, like you would mention, if you come into the UFC, you're 8-0, you're this big time prospect, and it's not like we've even seen him get better fight to fight. It seems like he consistently looks worse. And for Ibragimov, and again for Marques, there's not too many times, and we normally agree on this, if a guy comes in on short notice to fight someone, they should always get a second fight because, it's never under 100% circumstances. You don't know how well they were training, how well they were able to make weight, whatever excuse you want to throw out there. But they normally do get another fight with a promotion. If you lose to Khadis Ibragimov, I don't know if you deserve another fight with a promotion. And it's not me trying to be hard on Marques. It's just that's the point of Ibrahimov's career that I really see him at. The Ed Herman fight really summed it up. If you can get him past that 3-4 minute round, or 3-4 minute mark of the first round, that gas tank starts to fade early. I mean, we mentioned it in really all of his fights, but the Ed Herman fight, going the distance, it really showed that more than any other one. And it makes it really hard to pick a fight for Khadis Ibragimov, even though that's kind of how I'm leaning right now.
Yeah, I mean, it is really difficult. Again, age, you're siding with a Russian fighter here, 25 years, 4 months when he steps into the octagon. You look over at his opponent. I mean, like I said, 34 years old. And it's tough. I mean, especially with a guy who hasn't fought in such a long time. The other thing that's a bit of a head scratcher to you, it might be to me as well, is the fact that Khadis Ibragimov have been a minus 175 favorite coming into this fight. I'm surprised they're not closer to pick'em odds. I really am, just because of the relative inconsistency of the Russian fighter since he's come in from M1 Global. And it's not to say that M1 Global fighters haven't been great lately, but ask Roman Bogatov how he's making out these days after his fight with Leonardo Santos. No longer with the promotion. So it's a tough one there. If you look over on Tapology at a 728 votes, 67% going with Ibragimov, 50% saying he's going to win by knockout. I think that's a pretty ballsy pick. I will side with the Russian fighter in Khadis Ibragimov. I think if he does get into too many compromising positions, he might be able to make out all right. I mean, Da Un Jung is on a huge run right now, getting submitted by him in your UFC debut. While it sucks, it's not the end of the world. But I mean, yeah, I have to think if this trend continues past 3 losses in a row, that's got to be it, especially against a guy like Danilo Marques. I'm eager to see what we get out of Marques, but in terms of an overall prediction, it's probably the least confident on this card, and I'm going to reluctantly side with Khadis Ibragimov. And Matt, this is one of those fights kind of similar to last weekend. It's going to take a week of tape study until question mark kicks before we have a very confident, solid pick, but I'm going to go with Ibragimov in this one.
So it's hard to disagree with you, but I'm basically picking, do I like something that I've been really underwhelmed by over its last 3 fights, or just so many question marks in Danilo Marques? I'm going to side with Ibragimov just because there have been a few positives. I mean, he's got good wrestling defense. His cardio's, a thing. Like, there's a few things to take from him. He has okay punching power when he can land, and he does explode quite well in that first little time frame of the fight. It's just after that, this fight could get really interesting, although I am going to stick with Ibragimov.
All right, Matt, you're going with Ibragimov. I'm going with Ibragimov. Really looking forward to this card. Like I said, extended look at our 2 title fights at the top. You got Blachowicz taking on Reyes, and you've got Israel Adesanya taking on Paulo Costa. You're going to want to keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, Matt. And as we always say, let's get into it. This is my favorite heavyweight fight on the UFC 253 card, and scratch that. I mean, it's the only heavyweight fight. And I'm really looking forward to this one because we have Jeff Hughes, former LFA heavyweight champion, taking on the latest and greatest Ultimate Fighter winner. And how crazy is it to say that, Matt? I've been waiting for Juan Espino to make his UFC debut for the longest time. And Matt, the last time we saw him was almost 2 years ago, bridging on a year and 9 months ago when he took on a really tough out in Justin Frazier to win the season of the Ultimate Fighter. He's a guy that's really creeping up there in age. When he steps into the cage, he's going to be 2 weeks away from his 40th birthday. Crazy to see a heavyweight make his UFC debut that deep into his career. But Juan Espino, to me, is a really interesting case because he's kind of been like a bit of an ageless wonder. I mean, years ago, he took on a 4-0 Vitaly Minakov. Matt, how far did Vitaly Minakov go before he lost the fight? We're talking what? He was 21-0 at one point, Bellator champion. And I mean, that's the only blemish on Juan Espino's record. If you go over onto his Instagram, the guy's a roving thirst trap. But apart from that, he's a guy that trains over in the Canary Islands in Spain. And like I said, it's been a long time since we've seen Juan Espino competing, but we do know one thing. He can certainly finish a fight. Very sneaky with his grappling and his jiu-jitsu. He is definitely a bigger guy at the heavyweight limit. And so is Jeff Hughes. I mean, Jeff Hughes so far in the UFC, we definitely haven't seen the best of him. like I said, I mean, former LFA champ, had a win over Maurice Green over there, beat Josh Appelt on Dana White's Contender Series. But then since he came into the UFC, they rematched him with Maurice Green, lost a split decision there, had that weird fight against Todd Duffy that ended in an accidental eye poke. And then the fight after that, he was taking on Rafael Pessoa, and it definitely didn't go his way in that one. That fight's the one that really makes me worry about this one, because Rafael Pessoa and the heavyweight division in general, there's a lot of guys on that lower tier, and they always used to bring out these jobbers. I'm talking like Christian Colombo, Anthony Freight Train Hamilton was in there for a bit. Cyril Asker was one of those guys for a little bit. There's always those lower tier guys that you have to get a win over if you're going to move up into the division. So they'll put those guys up against the Cyril Gons or, I don't know, Tanner Bozer, or whoever it might be. Rafael Pessoa to me is one of those guys, and I hate to say it, like, I don't want to sound like a mean person, but I don't think Rafael Pessoa is going to be fighting for the title anytime soon. For Jeff Hughes to be 0-2-1, I guess, or 0-2 with the 1-0 contest there, it really makes me worry about his future in the UFC's heavyweight division. He's a good striker, but to put everything together in a fluid motion and really start throwing combos and getting into a rhythm, we haven't seen him do that in the UFC. We've seen his wrestling defense hold up. I mean, it's at a 75% clip over a very limited sample size so far. So he does have that in his back pocket, but it's not like Rafael Pessoa is the greatest grappler in the world. It's not like Maurice Green's the greatest grappler in the world. Go watch his fight against Alexei Oleinik if you want to see that. Or Jean Vellante, who's got a big fight coming up against Jake Collier.
Does he have
Collier. Yikes. But in terms of this fight and in general, Juan Espino, where do I see the ceiling for him? Definitely not title contender anytime soon. But I think at 40 years old, he can come in and really make a little bit of noise for himself.
Yeah, and this is a pretty good measuring stick for Juan Espino, because Jeff Hughes, I think we both agree, he's at the lower end of the heavyweight talent pool. So if you have a guy who's a little bit older in age, coming off an Ultimate Fighter win from a few years ago now too, that's the thing too. He's the last guy to win the Ultimate Fighter, and they're talking about bringing the show back, and he hasn't won for a meaningful amount of time at this point. So it's a good opponent to have him come back to. Jeff Hughes, like you had said, he's a good striker, but I think you said it in the right terms. He doesn't really throw as much as he should. The output's not always there. So when he does start to string together his combinations, you're like, oh, Jeff Hughes kind of putting it together. And then he'll just have kind of long points of inactivity throughout a fight where it seems like he's standing there almost in like a Yoel Romero type manner, where it's just him waiting and waiting and waiting. And if your name's Tyron Woodley and you've already won the title, you can get away with stuff like that. But Jeff Hughes, it's just the lack of output really concerns me in this fight. Because Juan Espino, yes, he's the better grappler by far. I mean, he's much more of a submission threat out of both guys. But on the feet, he is a good enough striker to at least overwhelm his opponent into opening up those takedown attempts later on.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Jeff Hughes, and this is the last point about him before we move on, I mean, 4.34 strikes landed per minute to 3.77. So it's good that he has a positive differential, especially in the heavyweight division. Yeah. Really nice numbers in terms of accuracy and defense, 51% accuracy, 61% defense. That is quite good. And like I said, I mean, if you look at the takedown accuracy, 50%, and his defense is 75%. Although it is a very limited sample size, those numbers are quite good, and they don't really go along with the fact that he has the 2 losses and then that 1-0 contest. And I mean, I got to say too, the loss to Maurice Green was by split decision. So take that as it is. The one thing that really does concern me in this fight, though, is the odds. I mean, we haven't seen Juan Espino in the longest time. He's been a fighter that I've, not called out on Twitter, but I keep saying, where are you at, Juan? Where have you been? And then finally I get my fix of Juan Espino coming up this weekend. He opened as a -220 favorite. That line dropped incredibly quickly, and he now sits at a -291 according to Best Fight Odds. So that's a hefty line in terms of a guy that's making his debut. He's been out for a really long time. You kind of scratch your head in terms of quality of camp and this and that you're going to get if you're over in Spain. And you look at Jeff Hughes, open as a +185. That line jumped up to a +238, 237, now sits at a +232 average. The other thing, if you look over in Tapology to the total votes, at a 797 votes, 90% going Espino, 64% saying he's going to win by submission. Man, that is way too much support for Juan Espino in a fight like this to me. This is another one of those fights where it's a little bit of a head scratcher because you have Juan Espino that's 2 weeks away from his 40th birthday. He's most likely going to get the win. I just can't justify throwing a ton of support to a guy that's been out for that long to be that big of a favorite. Yes, I've gone back. I've watched the fights. Do I think that Jeff Hughes is a world beater? Not so much. Do I think that Juan Espino has a path to the title tomorrow? Not so much. So it's a lower tier heavyweight fight. This is one that you fade. I'm going to go with Juan Espino, though. I do think that the upside's there. I think the submission abilities are there. Do I think that Jeff Hughes, a guy that has 3 total losses on his career, is going to hop in there, make a huge mistake, and get submitted? More than likely not, actually. But yeah, I'm going to side with Juan Espino in this one. And I'm really actually looking forward to this fight because lower tier heavyweight fights either over deliver or they're the worst fight on the card.
So, okay, a few mixed messages there. Thank God the UFC didn't hire us to promote this fight, because the last 30 seconds of what you just said was quite disrespectful to both guys. Let's just be honest. But no, it is kind of true. You have a 40-year-old guy who hasn't fought in years, fighting a guy who's not 0-3, but he's 0-2-1 in the UFC right now. And yes, that win over Maurice Green outside the UFC and LFA does look pretty good in hindsight. But you watch the rematch, that was one of the worst fights I've seen in a while, because it was just one of those classic low volume, both guys kind of get tired at heavyweight fights. I see this kind of turning into that if Juan Espino can't get the takedown, because we're just going to have Jeff Hughes putting on a striking clinic. And Jeff Hughes putting on a striking clinic isn't like, Max Holloway putting on a striking clinic. There's different levels. But I do think Juan Espino is going to be able to get it done. But like you said, the odds are a little bit off. There's just so many question marks around Juan Espino coming into this. But I think he should be able to get it done.
Matt, we're both going with Juan Espino, the return of El Guapo. We're not talking about Boss Rutan in this one. I'm really looking forward to this card. We got a great co-main event. Jan Blachowicz taking on Dominick Reyes for the light heavyweight title that was vacated by John Jones. We've got Israel Adesanya looking to hold on to his middleweight title, taking on the eraser Paulo Costa. So you're going to want to keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, Matt, as we always say. Let's get into it. Really interesting fight at light heavyweight, and this is a striker's paradise because we have William Knight, the Nightmare, making his UFC debut, long-awaited UFC debut against Aleksa Camur, and I'm really looking forward to this because for Aleksa Camur coming into the UFC, he was 5-0, all 5 wins by finish. You look over at William Knight, 8-1 to this point, every single win and the 1 loss, all by finish, and really all action type of guys. The striking is going to be there with both of these guys, and they can get incredibly creative, so it makes for a really interesting fight. The one really big question mark in this one, can the gas tanks hold up? If this goes past round 1, if it goes past round 2, I really sit here and scratch my head. But overall, it is a really interesting fight. With Aleksa Camur, you might recognize him from his time training with Strong Style Fight Team over in Ohio. And if you know that name, then you know the world's heavyweight champion, UFC heavyweight champion, and Stipe Miocic. And if you look at it for Aleksa Camur, he does a lot of things incredibly well, trains primarily with Alex Cooper. And if you know anything about Alex Cooper and Strong Style, he's that guy in the videos when they promote Stipe that's wearing that USA flag shooting sleeve and holding the mitts.
The hype man in the back.
He doesn't get as loud as Jason Perillo does when people hit mitts with Perillo, and I'm going to get really loud here because if you ever watch Perillo, it's doosh, doosh, and he gets his fighters into it. Ask Mackenzie Dern and look at her striking against Randa Marcos, but I digress. In terms of this fight, though, William Knight, he came in, performed well on Dana White's Contender Series against Herdem Alekabek, and they gave him a developmental deal, and they've handed a few of those out. Chase Hooper is one of those fighters. Greg Hardy was another one. So William Knight was one of those guys. And I remember I was watching CFFC. I want to say it was one of the Dacus brothers that was fighting. They had William Knight on commentary. They were pumping his tires a little bit. So he comes out, has a fight against Jamel Jones with CS. Then he fights with CFFC. And this is only 9 months ago against a fighter that we'd end up seeing on Contender Series in Tafon and Chukwi. And oh boy, he finished William Knight. So then you sit there and you wonder, well, I've got this prospect. He's on a developmental deal. And if he was to lose like a close decision or if he got gas late in the fight, you'd think, okay, well, back to the drawing board. That's why we have these developmental deal contracts. But he gets finished. So what does he do? Does he sit in a corner, cry and sulk? No, he comes out not that long after, and we're talking like 2 or 3 months later, takes on Rocky Edwards, finishes him, and then he takes on Cody Brundage on this season of Contender Series, and it wasn't that long ago. Like, we're talking 2 weeks ago, and finishes him. So for William Knight, he's rebounded quite well since that finished loss. For Aleksa Camur, like I said, we had all those finishes in his first 5 fights. Comes into the UFC, fights Justin Ledet. He's a pretty big favorite. He impressed because he won the fight and he turned it up. From the first round to the second round, he turned it up. And then the third round, things kind of went down a little bit in terms of the output. Now, he did land a takedown in that one, so take that for what it's worth in that third round. But I just worry about both of these guys and their futures because both interesting prospects coming into the UFC, both with plenty of finishing ability. What's going to happen in this fight? It's pretty well anybody's guess. I mean, you're talking about 2 guys that can finish anybody really in this division. What do you make of this fight? It's an interesting choice in booking, and I think it's actually a really good one.
It really is. And William Knight, again, I mention this all the time, he's got that Jimmy Manuwa fighting style where you either win by knockout or you lose by knockout. And when you fight like that, I don't really think your record matters. I think Justin Gaethje is another guy who's kind of reached this level where he could lose 9 fights in a row, but would you really care? Not really. It's just because the way he fights, you're going to want to pay attention. Cowboy's basically lost 5 in a row, but it still feels like there's hype around all of his fights. So not to say William Knight in his first UFC fight has reached that level yet, but I do think he can be a guy who, no, he's not in the top 15 forever at 205, but he's a guy who, he's on the prelims, I'm going to tune in. And Aleksa Camur, a guy who we were both pretty high when he was coming into the UFC, especially fighting Justin Ledet. Not the most recognizable name, but if you're a hardcore, you definitely, you recognize who Justin Ledet is. And not that beating him puts you, on this rocket to the top of the division, but beating him proves that you do belong in the UFC. And that fight was really frustrating because Camur, you could tell, was definitely the more skilled guy out of the 2. It just seemed like he was so labored after that second round that it was, okay, if he gets in there with a guy who's got a little bit more pop on his shots and a little bit better cardio than Camur himself has, he kind of leaves himself to get finished because he just starts throwing those big, just kind of arm flailing shots, doesn't have a lot behind it, and he's not over committing really, so he's not getting out ahead of his punches where he's just going to get clipped bad, but he's making enough mistakes that you can really tell that if he fights a higher level guy, they might be able to take advantage of it. This fight, though, again, it's hard to live up to this, but it could be one of those Gilbert Melendez, Diego Sanchez kind of first rounds where it's just, okay, we're both going to start swinging. One of us, we're both probably going to get tired, so let's just hope one of us falls for the end of the first round. I think it could be one of those really exciting ones. William Knight, great Muay Thai, really good leg kicks too. Kind of a weird stat when you go back and look that he fought Yorgan de Castro, UFC heavyweight, also NEF cruiserweight champion.
And we love to cover NEF. Bring us back.
Exactly.
If that land border opens with Maine, Craig out.
Yeah,
me.
So the fact that he fought him not only once in MMA in the amateurs, but then again in Muay Thai, it's kind of an interesting fact. So I do think this should be a good, technical, entertaining fight for as long as it lasts. But I'm kind of siding with William Knight as the underdog.
And it's interesting because we've had it so far in the first 3 fights that we profiled. And again, maybe the order changes, but we had quick drops in the odds. And we had this last weekend too. And it was something that was interesting to monitor as the week went on because you had really swift drops. And even with those swift drops, there were underdogs that hit that a lot of people didn't favor, I guess, or that at least gamblers and odds makers didn't favor. So if you look at the lines, Aleksa Camur opened a -130 favorite, and that line dropped on the first day. He's now -178 average over on best fight odds. If you look at William Knight, his opposite, he was at a +110. The line went all the way up to about a +160, and he now sits at a +145. So it's interesting that way because, like you said, William Knight, the underdog, if you go over in Tapology, out of 802 votes, 56% going Knight, 87% of those voters saying that he's going to win by knockout. If you look at the line for Camur, 44% of fans, obviously the difference, picking him to win, 58% saying he's going to win by knockout. So I can certainly see a path to victory for both guys. But I do like William Knight, like you said, in this fight. I know he's been finished. I know it's one of those things that a lot of people are probably going to bring up. They're going to go back and they're going to say, well, geez, at the time he's 6-0. He's taking on a guy that was 2-0. You shouldn't be losing by knockout. But you've seen what his opponent's done in his last number of fights and how good Nchukwi can be. And especially on a big stage like Contender Series this year, picking up a really big win. So for William Knight, it was a bit of a stumble, but again, if you can get a win over a guy like Rocky Edwards, it's really proved it against some good regional talent. And then you come back out and you beat Cody Brundage, a guy that was 5-0 at the time. I think that the ball's definitely in William Knight's court to lose this one. And I'm going to side with the fighter coming out of Connecticut here.
Yeah, I just think technically he's a little bit more sound. And if he can land that leg kick and really get Aleksa Camur working throughout that first round, he should be able to put him down, later second, maybe into the third round, hopefully get a finish.
Matt, I'm really looking forward to this fight. Both of us going with William Knight in his UFC debut to pick up the win. You're not going to want to miss the rest of our prediction for the card. We've got an extended look at our co-main event between Jan Blachowicz and Dominick Reyes for the light heavyweight title, as well as Israel Adesanya looking to keep his middleweight belt against Paulo Costa. So keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, as we always say, Matt. Let's get into it. Matt, no word of a lie. This is one of my favorite fights on this card and a potential fight of the night. We have a UFC debut in Ludovic Klein coming at us from Slovakia. He's actually the first UFC fighter from Slovakia, and he's taken on Sugar Shane Young. And it's such an interesting fight because if you look at Ludovic Klein, I have to really gush here for a second because, Matt, we talked about it last weekend. We had David Dvorak taking on Jordan Espinosa. Now, Dvorak coming at us from the Czech Republic, but the fact is, he was coming from that octagon scene. And if there's one MMA promotion that I could attend live before I die, it has to be, well, it's a close one. It's either KSW or Octagon, because Octagon puts on these awesome shows. I think they pay a lot of money for some of their talent, but they put on some really fun fights. And if you look at Ludovic Klein, I mean, man, this guy is, and I don't want to overstate it, but he's kind of like a pocket version of Edson Barboza. And I say that Edson Barboza is now fighting at featherweight, but Ludovic Klein, if you go back and watch some of his, just, I say highlight reel, but if you watch his entire body of work on the regional scene, holy smokes, this guy's such an explosive striker, really stands with almost like a nice Thai stance. I know you might see that he has a boxing background, this and that, but keeps his hands nice and high. He'll fight out a southpaw, keeps his feet kind of further apart. I've seen some comparisons actually to a Wonder Boy, but the thing that he does with his kicks, he throws a really nice high kick from either stance. So it could be his left leg or his right leg that he throws up there really quick and high. He'll catch guys on the chin. And out of his last 2 wins over there in Octagon against Yoao, Paulo Rodriguez, a great knockout kick there. And against Lukasz Sajowski, really, really big wins there. This guy's coming in with a head of steam, 7-fight win streak. His last loss was to a guy that a lot of people over in Cage Warriors recognize in Aiden Lee, losing that one by first-round submission back in 2017. But since then, he just continues to finish guys and put on really impressive performances. And for Shane Young, this is a guy that it's got to be weird because his last loss against Alexander Volkanovski, and oh, by the way, you're training at City Kickboxing now with Alexander Volkanovski. But Shane Young in his last 2 fights, some really big wins. You look at it, Rolando D, who we've seen him on the UAE scene, look into his dad's past, really sketchy. But the win over Rolando D, and then you have the win over Austin Arnett in his last one. That's a pretty big win as well. We haven't seen him in over a year and a half, so it's been a while since we've seen Shane Young in the octagon. Great to see him back here. I think it's an excellent job of matchmaking because Shane Young, kind of like that new breed of MMA fighter, really well-rounded in every discipline. Ludovic Klein on the opposite side, though, holy smokes, this guy's striking is so explosive. And it's the reason why I think a lot of fans might not be familiar with him, kind of like David Dvorak when he was coming to the UFC. And then, boom, he's on the scene. I think both these guys have decent enough ceilings, but I think if you have a skill set like Klein has at 25 years old, the world's, your oyster, and the sky's the limit for this guy. And I hate to talk in cliches, but I am really excited about this debut for Klein.
It should be a great fight, and I do think this is a great fight to really see where Klein matches up in the division. Because Shane Young, it's really hard to know what you're going to get from him. So I know you're worse than Alexander Volkanovski, but you're better than Rolando Dye. Yeah. You're everyone on planet Earth. So it's not really narrowing it down as to what or where he can look at in the division. The Austin Arnett win is a good one because at least that's a guy who is fairly talented, who you could see putting together a 3-4 fight win streak potentially in the UFC. I think Shane Young's kind of along that. I like what you had said. He's sort of the new version of an MMA fighter, less so of that specialist, which is what we're seeing in Klein. But the problem is, it's not like Shane Young has this very extensive wrestling background where if he starts getting lit up on the feet, he can just go in, double leg climb to the ground, and then that'll solve all my problems. He might be able to do that. But that's really what's great about having such a well-rounded guy fighting such a specialist. We really get to see, okay, if the specialist in Klein can defend a few takedown attempts and just force most guys to stand and strike with him, he's going to have a ton of success moving forward in the UFC. And one of the more entertaining divisions in featherweight, it's a division full of strikers for the most part. So you never have to worry about those really poor stylistic matchups if you are Klein. I think it's a very fun fight. It should be a good way to see, like I said, how Klein measures up going forward in the UFC. And I'm kind of going towards him, even though I do think Shane Young, he's going to be around for a long time. He's going to be a guy at featherweight who Yes, he might not get a number next to his name, but he's going to put on good fights. But the fact that he hasn't fought in quite a while does concern me. It's not like he's been in there and been consistent while Klein's been outside the UFC. You have a guy who's also kind of getting rid of some octagon rust as the other guy's experiencing octagon jitters. So it'll be interesting to see which one wins out.
And if you look at Shane Young, I mean, the numbers are going to be skewed a little bit, but his strikes given and taken 6.1 to 5.09. We're putting on fun fights, and we're outstriking Rolando D by quite a bit. I mean, at a 2-1 clip. So you beat the piss out of a guy that's back on the regional scene again and had no success in the UFC. And you beat Austin Arnett quite handily. Nice unanimous decision win there. You lost by unanimous decision to Alexander Volkanovski, where you pretty well get dominated. So in this fight, a little bit of a head scratcher. Shane Young, the favorite, opened as minus 165. The line dropped on him quite quickly. He almost got to a 2-1 favorite. And now it went right back up. He's about a minus 132 over on best fight odds. You look at Klein making his UFC debut, open as a plus 125. He's now sitting at a plus 108. The money continues to come in on Klein. I think people are seeing those impressive performances. And if this is a fight that just takes place on the feet, it's Klein all day. I just have to see how he's going to be tested against a guy that is well-rounded. We saw it against Aiden Lee, who, if you look at him and you watch his Cage Warriors performances, he's a submission artist to the highest degree, or to the nth degree, as many would say. Ludwig Klein, though, really trying to put Slovakia on the map. And when I think of Slovak, athletes, I'm thinking Zdeno Chara. I'm thinking Miroslav Shatan. I'm thinking Peter Bondra. I'm going deep cuts with the NHL.
Luka?
But Luka Doncic. It's great to see more and more fighters representing this country, and Ludwig Klein really putting, MMA on the map, coming at us from a gym that, maybe a lot of people haven't heard of. He's representing Spartak Fight Gym, or Spartacus Fight Gym. So neat to see there as well. With some recognizable names from that gym. Nonetheless, if you look over on Tapology, 723 votes on this fight, 60% going with Klein, and it's a surprise to me, 64% pick him to win by knockout. I'm going Klein, but by decision, and I think this has the opportunity to be a really, really fun fight. If we get a finish, it's just kind of the cherry on top of the cake. But who are you going with here?
So I'm really hoping that Klein will turn into more of a Hazmat Shemaev than he will a Mark Chikasi, because I do think striking-wise, he has that Chikasi kind of it factor to his game, where if he is going to go out there and start getting these highlight reel KOs, he could really start moving up the rankings fast. But as we saw with Mark Chikasi, all of that skill in the striking department does come with a few drawbacks when it comes to, cardio and grappling. So hopefully Klein does have more of a well-rounded game plan, more of a well-rounded skill set too. And if he picks up a win over Shane Young, it doesn't get easier from that point on. Like, that's a hard first fight in the UFC to have for Ludwig Klein. So hopefully he can get it done and then really move on to bigger, brighter things afterwards.
Matt, so from the way that it's sounding, Hamzat Shemaev should change his nickname from Boris to Hazmat, because that's what you went with there. But I'm really looking forward to this fight, Matt. We're both going with Klein. Possible fight of the night, so you're not going to want to miss that fight. But as well, the predictions for the rest of this card in the playlist. We're keeping it long this week, so you can check it out with probably 2 hours plus. But we're going to clip them up, and you're going to be able to find those in the playlist. So keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks. Both of us going with Klein. We've got an extended preview of our main event and co-main event, both for the titles. You got Adesanya looking to hold on to his belt against the eraser Paulo Costa, and you've got Dominick Reyes taking on Jan Blachowicz, and both of those guys competing for the vacant light heavyweight belt. Matt, really looking forward to this card. Keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, and as we always say, let's get into it. Hopefully you have your humors aligned. You've got your crystals. Maybe you got a Ouija board nearby, because we have Diego Sanchez. Now, is he the Nightmare? Does he have an extra nickname that he's going to bring into fight week? And how is coaching under Mr. Joshua Fabia going? I don't know. He's taking on Jake Matthews, the Celtic kid, this week. And Matt, Jake Matthews on a little bit of a run. We knew him at 155 pounds. We've seen what he can do at 170 pounds. And I know he has that one blip on the radar, especially in his last 5 fights against Anthony Rocco Martin. But there was a time not that long ago where Anthony Rocco Martin ranked at welterweight. And Rocco, similar to Jake Matthews, and I know that's a conversation we had before they fought, was really, what do we get out of this guy at 55? Is a future there? And for Jake Matthews, a little bit younger when he was fighting at 55, and you kind of scratched your head. Same thing with Rocco, hitting a stride at 70. And Jake Matthews, Matt, going to be walking into the cage having just celebrated his 26th birthday. He's been around for a while.
Yeah.
It's just that in this fight, he's taking on a guy that's been around for the longest time in Diego Sanchez, coming in from the Ultimate Fighter when the Ultimate Fighter came in. Like, it's insane. We know the fact that Diego Sanchez, he's competed at what, 45, 55. He's competed at 70
and 80.
And 85. And if you look at it in terms of the UFC record book, if he fights, he's going to tie for 4th all time of most total fights in the UFC. He's going to tie with Damian Maia at 32, as well as Andrei Arlovski. If he wins, he's going to tie John Jones and George St. Pierre, as well as Michael Bisping, for most wins in the UFC at 4th, I guess, all time. And for Diego Sanchez, if he wins by decision, he's going to top George St. Pierre for most decision wins in the UFC. He's also going to lap, hopefully, if this fight doesn't end incredibly quickly, he's going to pass Jeremy Stephens for 4th all time in most total fight time in the UFC. He currently sits at 6 hours and 22 minutes. Wow. That's insane. Jeremy Stephens, 6 hours and 28 minutes. And from Diego Sanchez in his last 5 fights, he's kind of got that Shogun vibe going right now because he's not losing fights. And in his last
right
5,
now.
He's 3-2. He's got that disqualification win against Michel Pereira where he was losing that fight. And it was a fight where it was kind of weird. I mean, Diego Sanchez has been a pinnacle of New Mexico MMA for the longest time. That fight was in Rio Rancho, and it was a tough look. I think his kids were there, which is kind of weird. And it wasn't a good showing, but he won, and he asked the referee if, was that shot illegal? Yeah, it's illegal. All right, here we go. So we have Diego Sanchez, he talked on Mike Swick's podcast back about a month ago that he's got 4 fights left on his deal and he intends on fighting those 4 out. And then that's it for him. That's one of those things that you never want to hear. But I mean, listen, Diego Sanchez has been there and done that. 4 different weight classes for the longest time. He's 38 years old, almost 39. He's putting on competitive fights. I mean, you look at the fight against the Thundercat, Craig White, and
watch it
on me with the Thundercat predictions, but he had the win there where he looked good. He had the win over Mickey Gall, where Mickey Gall didn't look like he belonged in that fight. So at least he's hanging in there against some of these guys at 170. It's just the fact that Jake Matthews, really good takedown offense and takedown defense, decent striking on the feet. He can kind of do it in a lot of different areas. And oh, by the way, he's the biggest favorite on this card, more than a 7-1 favorite on most sites. What do you think about this one here?
This is such a weird fight because Jake Matthews, you kind of know what you're going to get. He hits fairly hard. He's a big guy at 170, which is weird because he was a 155er, but he's just he's fairly big. He failed into the division quite well. There's a lot of guys who kind of move up and down, but you can tell they don't give their body enough time to adjust to the new weight class. But Jake Matthews has been at 170 for a while now, really filled into the division quite well. Diego Sanchez is weird because at this stage in his career, he's going to go for takedowns. He's going to have that kind of wonky, stiff sort of striking style that he does. He just can't take a shot. And it's really unfortunate, but even in the Craig White fight, gets hit by an up kick, gets dropped. Michel Pereira, yes, he won that fight, but it was a very Matt Hamill kind of win. It was, I'm going to get beat for a lot of it, get hit by an illegal strike, and that's how I win. Now, yes, that counts in the record book, so it doesn't really matter what I say or how controversial it was. But when you actually look at the performances from each of his fights, when he fights, not someone who's any good, I won't go that far, but when he does fight the guys who are in that top, I'll say even 25 category, you start to run into some problems because Matt Brown, yes, this was a Matt Brown from about 3 years ago, so he's a little bit different. And Matt Brown holds a special place in my heart forever because he's just one of the most exciting UFC fighters ever. But you look at what he was able to do, Diego Sanchez, and just destroy him with one shot. You see what Ali Quinta was able to do to him. You see what Michael Chiesa was able to do to him. And that wasn't even, I knocked him out. It's just, I'm better than you at everything. He was able to take him down, dominate him on the feet. There's just not many positions in this fight that I see Diego Sanchez having a big advantage in. His cardio might be a little bit better than Jake Matthews, but that'd really be the only thing I say he does better than Jake Matthews.
Now, this is the question that I'm going to ask you. So 5 fights ago, you got Sanchez versus Brown. And if you look at it on the opposite side, Jake Matthews, so we gave him some shine. We talked about him kind of having a good move up to 70. The one lost to Anthony Rocco Martin. Diego Sanchez, he looked like he's gone so much further over the hill since that Matt Brown fight? And has Jake Matthews improved so much in his last 4, I guess, since he fought Li Jingliang? Because to me, I haven't really seen a big uptick in competition for Jake Matthews. So you beat Li Jingliang in the fight that It was a weird one. You had the eye gouging, so he wins that fight. It was closer than I would have wanted it to be, though. He beat Shinjo Anjai, which, I mean, here's the thing I can say about Shinjo Anjai. When he left the UFC and went over to Bellator to fight Michael Venom Page, they were billing, or people were billing Anjai as, oh, that's just another jobber and another can for MVP to add to his highlight reel. So Jake Matthews has a win over Shinjo Anjai. Okay, big deal. He loses to Rocco, who, again, we're talking like a 20 to 15 guy, and on his best day, maybe closer to 10. So he loses that fight. And then he beats Rostam Akman, who, I mean, the guy looks like he wears a sweater when he walks into the cage.
Craig, stop it right now. If you're trying to convince me right now that Jake Matthews is going to lose this fight, you need to stop, and we can change this to something else. We can start talking about baseball.
All we need to say is the fact that a win over Li Jingliang, which it was a weird fight, a win over Shinjo Anjai, a win over Rostam Akman, and a win over Emil Mech aren't as big as the fights or aren't as tough of competition as maybe Diego Sanchez taking on. You talked about it. We're talking Matt Brown.
The Mickey Galls of the world.
Michael Chiesa. We're talking Michel Pereira, who I think Michel Pereira, if he can hone it in, I'm not saying you're a top welterweight, but you're going to put on really impressive performances against some of the better fighters in the division. All of this is to say that I look at the odds, and I had mentioned it from the start. I mean, Jake Matthews, biggest favorite on the card, opens a minus 450. He's now a minus 699. So I guess I fibbed a little bit. Minus 699 average on best fight odds. So there are some different sites that have a minus 750. Diego Sanchez open plus 350, now at a plus 478 if you look over at the average. And then over on Tapology out of the total picks at a 909 total picks, 90% going Jake Matthews, 58% saying he's going to win by decision, 32% by knockout. He's an overwhelming favorite. He hasn't taken on the same level of competition that Diego Sanchez has, I believe, in his last 5. I don't think it matters a whole much. It's just an interesting talking point that I find relevant to bring up. All of this to say that Jake Matthews, in terms of his overall grappling, much better at taking it to the ground and holding position than Diego Sanchez is. And I think he definitely threatens more there. I think that's probably where you're going to see him take the fight. Maybe see a flash knockout. I don't totally see it. But I see Jake Matthews just grinding out a decision win here.
Yeah, I mean, he's going to try to do what Michael Chiesa did Diego Sanchez, just kind of wear on him throughout the fight. Now, Chiesa is much better than Jake Matthews, but they kind of do the same things. Just I'd say Chiesa is a little bit better at everything. He's a little bit more well-rounded out of the two, even though Jake Matthews is very well-rounded. I think Jake Matthews hits harder. I think he has better striking. I think he has a better ground game. I think he has better wrestling. Unless he starts eating a lot of body shots early on in the clinch, because Diego Sanchez did have pretty knees in the clinch. We did see that in the Mickey Gall fight. That's one positive I can take. If he can use that in this fight, start to wear on Jake Matthews a little bit on his cardio, he might be able to take an advantage going into that third round. But that's the only thing I can see Diego Sanchez doing that could be positive in this fight. I don't know how Jake Matthews loses this. If he does, it'll be very surprising to me.
And that's what I was trying to bring in as well, or I wanted to bring as well. The fact that Diego Sanchez, if he's going to win this fight whatsoever, you have to expect maybe a little bit of clinch work. If he's on the ground, he could try and threaten a submission. But apart from that, I mean, his numbers are going to be absolutely skewed. Like I said, I mean, we're talking about a guy that's in the top 10 in total fight time in the UFC, top in wins, top in total fights. He's been around for the longest time. So the numbers are skewed. You really have to look at the sample size of his last 5 fights and where he has taken on the Matt Brown and then the Craig White and then the Mickey Gall and then the Chiesa and then Pereira somewhere in there as well. It's really tough to try and gauge it that way. Yes, he's 3-2 out of those, but the Pereira loss is a bit of a scratch. And then we're talking Gall White versus Chiesa Brown. So where does Diego Sanchez really fit into this division? I don't think as highly as Jake Matthews. This is a fight that I would definitely fade because, again, what's the point of going with a guy that's a 7-1 favorite in Jake Matthews if you have a guy in Diego Sanchez where maybe the methods of victory aren't as plentiful as they are for Jake Matthews, but overwhelmingly, yes, I agree with you. I'm going Jake Matthews. You're also going Jake Matthews?
Oh, 100%. Probably by finish, probably however he wants it. If he wins by knockout, I wouldn't be surprised if he wins by submission. I wouldn't be. Okay, I'd be surprised if he submits him just because Chiesa wasn't able to, but I just don't see how Jake Matthews can throw this fight away.
But there's definitely fights on here that are a lot closer, so you're going to want to keep it locked in with Fight Night picks. We're both going with Jake Matthews, but hey, we got a great couple of title fights. You got Reyes and Blachowicz. You've got Adesanya taking on Costa. So you're going to want to keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, Matt. As we always say, let's get into it. I get a look at this, and I'm sure somebody's probably going to trademark it before me. And it seems like every card, I have a few fights where I get the opportunity to say this. And in my best Coolio impression, we've been spending most of our lives living in a striker's paradise. And this is another one of those fights. And I love fights like this. We have Brad Quake Riddell coming at us, the former striking coach at Phuket Top Team, or sorry, Tiger Muay Thai. It wasn't Phuket Top Team. Out of Phuket, and he's taking on Alex de Silva. And Matt, Alex de Silva, I know if you look at his record in his last 5 fights, he's 3-2. He's taken on competition. This is a guy that really lights it up on the feet as well, and that's why it makes for such an interesting fight. A longer fighter in this division, so that's what also adds a little bit of a wrinkle into this one. And for Brad Riddell, I mean, he does have that 1 loss on his record. He's on a tidy little win streak. And we've seen what Tiger Muay Thai striking coaches have done as of late. Go look at Rafael Fiziev and his fight against Mark Jacasey. But Brad Riddell, the OG, you had Fiziev taking over for him at Tiger Muay Thai. And what can we say to Brad Riddell? I mean, he's a main training partner with Alexander Volkanovski. Do you know him? You probably should. You saw him in his corner when you saw Volkanovski defending his belt against Holloway in their rematch. Now, for Brad Riddell, so far in the UFC, I don't want to say it's been a mixed bag, but it's been 2 totally different fights, because in the Jamie Malarkey fight, he looked amazing. In the fight against Magomed Mustafayev, it was another one of those strikers paradise type of fights where Mustafayev is the type of guy to go in there and throw a spinning wheel kick and knock your lights totally out. In that fight, he definitely passed the test. It was a close decision win. I know I looked it up over on Best Fight Odds, and it kind of went both ways. There were more people that had votes for Mustafayev, or more people scored the fight for Mustafayev. If you looked at the overall decision, 29-28 Riddell, 29-28 Mustafayev, and then the other judge scoring it for Riddell. I believe I'd scored it Magomed Mustafayev at 29-28, but again, it was a really close fight. There were a couple of media scores, 30-27 for Riddell. All that to say that he can, if it goes to the ground, I don't worry about him too much. But when it's on the feet, this guy can light you the F up. So what do you make out of this one? Because I think Alex de Silva, yeah, you lose a fight to Alexander Yakovlev by submission. All right, that's not good, because Alexander Yakovlev so far in the UFC, mixed bag. You beat Kazula Vargas. Okay.
Doesn't tell you much.
All right, doesn't tell you a whole lot. So you got to go back and watch his performances on the regional scene. He's lighting guys up. Really young guy, too, for the division, to have so much experience. He's going to walk into the octagon a few months shy of his 25th birthday. So it's nice to see a guy that's 21-2. Maybe it's been a mixed bag of competition, but at least you have that experience coming into the UFC. So overall, you've got a really, really technical, high-level striker, and you've got a guy that's done it on the regional scene, young guy. What do you make of this one?
This is a super exciting fight that I could see play out as fight of the night, only if Adesanya and Costa wasn't the main event. Because this is one of those fights that you look at in the card and you sort of highlight it. You're like, okay, no matter what I'm doing that night, I'm going to make sure I'm at my TV for at least this fight. And I don't really think you told the story of that Mustafayev fight all that well, because in that fight, every time they were on the feet, Brad Riddell was lighting him on fire, and he was landing combinations, body shots, headshots. It was just Mustafayev would get a takedown and just sort of not lay and pray, because that's not really his style, but at least in that fight, he would secure the takedown, not do much, but just gather a whole bunch of top control time. So at the end of the fight, you look at it and you're like, okay, when they were on the feet, or who did the most damage? Well, Brad Riddell did by far the most damage. He got knocked down. He landed a bunch of strikes on the feet. It's just Mustafayev had a lot of control time. So it depends on what you value more. I did think Riddell won that fight. And this fight should be entertaining because, like you had mentioned, you're not just talking about a good striker. You're talking about a guy who was the main striking coach at Tiger Muay Thai, which is one of the better striking gyms in the world. So to have him transition over at MMA, and now he's training with guys like Alexander Volkanovski, Dan Hooker, Israel Adesanya, like that's a great team that City Kickboxing has right now. And I don't really think we're going to realize till like years down the line of how crazy their roster right now is of fighters. You have 2 champions, another top 5 guy, and then a guy who looks like he is kind of on his way to become a future top 15 guy in Riddell. This fight will be interesting because you have that kind of really good, nice technique of Riddell versus sort of the wildness of De Silva. And I hate to mention this all the time when you have a long Brazilian fighter, but De Silva does fight a lot like Brazilian Cowboy. He's got that sort of kind of herky jerk style where he lunges forward. It's kind of Nico Price-esque too, because when you look at Nico Price fight, he kind of lunges with that right hand. He throws those whipping front kicks. De Silva's going to offer you a little bit of that stuff too, but the only downside for De Silva is the thing he's really good at, Brad Riddell's great at. So I just don't see him being able to outstrike Brad Riddell for 15 minutes in an MMA fight.
Yeah, it's a tough one to try and side with De Silva. And I know Brad Riddell, he opened as minus 240 favorite. That line dropped off the bat to minus 300. He now sits at a minus 325. So a bit of a trickle down effect for him. De Silva opened plus 205. Again, all the way up, and now he's at a plus 254 according to Best Fight Odds, and that's just an average of all the sites. If you look over at the votes on Tapology, 852 votes, 88% going Riddell, 71% predicting a win by decision. I got to agree with the fan voting. I got to agree with the odds there, and I remember when De Silva made his UFC debut, and not to say that it was crickets, but for a guy to have that much experience being a young fighter, it was kind of like, why aren't we hearing more about him? I remember on the broadcast, I think it was Bisping gave him quite a bit of shine as he made the walk to the octagon. Like, this guy's been there and done that. This guy has a ton of finishes. You should watch out for him. And that's all I heard about him fight week. And then he gets submitted by Alexander Yakovlev, the most vanilla version of a lightweight fighter that really, footnote in the entirety of the division. So You lose that fight. You beat Kazula Vargas, who lost to Brock Weaver. That doesn't tell me much at all. So yeah, I do like what you say too, because I think this fight plays out not really like Bobby Green and Alan Patrick, but you have kind of similar styles in there where Bobby Green is a more technical boxer than Brad Riddell is. Yeah, but Brad Riddell is one of the better strikers that you're going to find in this division in total, taking on a bit of a question mark in De Silva. Has De Silva made leaps and bounds moves since he had that fight against Kazula Vargas? And I mean, a win, I should add, too, about a year ago. I don't know. We haven't really seen it. So, yeah, I have to side with the guy that we've seen a lot more on in terms of fight-ready competition, in terms of the pedigree of striking in Brad Riddell. And I think it's a bit of a no-brainer to go with Riddell here.
Yeah, I do think Brad Riddell is going to be like the Vicente Luque of 155. Like, he's going to be a guy who's going to finish a lot of guys, have really exciting fights. Will he win the title? Maybe, maybe not. But at the end of the day, you don't really care. You need just exciting fighters at a certain point. And I think he's going to be one of those guys who's in that top, maybe 6 on his best day to like 15 on his worst day. And you're always just going to be looking forward to them fighting. So I do think Brad Riddell is going to be able to get it done.
Well, Matt, we're really looking forward to this, both going with City Kickboxing Zone, Brad Riddell to pick up the win. And hey, is City Kickboxing Zone going to get the win in the main event between Israel Adesanya and Paulo Costa? You're going to have to check out that extended preview, including an extended look at our co-main event between Jan Blachowicz and Dominick Reyes. So keep it locked in with Fight Name Picks, Matt. And as we always say, let's get into it. This is one of the most intriguing fights on the card at 145 pounds. We get a pick'em fight between me and Hakeem Dawodu taking on Zubaira Tukhugov. And Matt, it's interesting because not that long ago, Zubaira Tukhugov had a feud with the greatest of all time, Artem Lobov. And it's just a shame that fight never materialized. But if you look at his overall body of work, bit of a head scratcher. If you look in the last 5 fights type of mentality, you can throw it totally out of the window, because his fifth to last fight was almost 6 years ago. It's insane how long of a layoff he had at a certain point in his career. And we're talking a win over Ernest Chavez. He finishes him. He beats Felipe Nover, who was compared to GSP by Mike Goldberg on a broadcast one time. And then he loses a split decision to Anato Moicano, has an incredibly long layoff of over 3 years, fights Lerone Murphy to a split, draw? Yeah, it was a draw. And then after that fight, he picks up win over Kevin Aguilar. What does that tell me? Lerone Murphy was coming in as a relative unknown and looked great. And hey, Lerone Murphy's last fight, pretty darn good too. So Lerone Murphy, really excited about your career prospects in the UFC. I think you're somebody that people have to watch. But for Zubaira Tukhugov, a lot of people focus on him because coming out of that same camp out of Dagestan with Habib, one of those main training partners that a lot of people were really excited about, and for good reason, quite a long time ago. That's the thing. So Zubaira Tukhugov, have I been impressed by him in his last number of fights? Well, in the Lerone Murphy fight, it was really close. I could see somebody giving that fight to either guy. I know it ended a draw, but it was a very close fight. One of those rounds not so close. in his last fight against Kevin Hegler. So he beat a guy from the LFA scene. What does that tell me? What did it tell you?
Well, it was a weird fight because, and here's the thing too, this fight's such a contrast in styles because you know that Tukhugov can do everything. It's just he's so dominant at the things he does well. If you want to get, like you had mentioned with Mustafayev, if you want to either get spun kicked in the head or taken down 20 times, Zubaira Tukhugov can do both of those things for you. Now, Hakeem Dawodu has a few things to counter that, though. I think the calf kick's really important in this fight. And we could kind of say that in every fight at this point now in MMA. Calf kicks in MMA are kind of like 3-pointers in basketball all of a sudden. Like if you're not doing it, you're way behind everyone else. But Hakeem Dawodu, it's at least a part of his game to where he ends his combinations with it. There's a lot of jab, left hook, right leg kick, where it's just how he ends it. So he's always staying active that way. The thing that concerns me about Dawodu, though, that inactivity, that really weird, he'll start landing combinations. You're like, oh, the tide's really starting to shift in his favor. And then he'll kind of just let the fight get away from him. Jorge Masvidal mentioned kind of at the start of his career before he had that, year away on the reality TV show that he would get ahead in fights and then kind of coast. And it was sort of unintentional. He didn't mean to do it. It was just mentally he knew, okay, I'm ahead in this fight. Let's not exert all of my energy and get tired. And I don't know if that's something that Hakeem's dealing with because it does seem like he'll do really great at the start of a round. And I think he has started to get better at it as his career's progressed. But I think he gets off to these great leads and it'll just kind of allow himself to coast where when you think about it, he's got really good cardio and he's an explosive guy even in that third round. So if he was able to just kind of up his intensity and his pressure, he'd be able to start putting it on a lot of guys, I would assume, especially as, they start to fatigue. So this fight really comes down to can Dawodu defend a single leg takedown? And really, can Tukhugov have an answer for the forward pressure and the leg kicks and really Muay Thai Dawodu? Because if Tukhugov is just going to hope to stand on the feet and try to land some crazy spinning technique, I think Hakeem probably puts him down.
The interesting thing, too, here is the fact that, if you look at a path to victory for Zubaira Tukhugov, well, I mean, he's like a Swiss Army knife. He can get it done on the feet. But really what we've seen out of those last two fights, the Lerone Murphy fight, Kevin Aguilar fight, a little bit different because you're taking on a good wrestler in Kevin Aguilar, is the fact that the wrestling and the scrambles are really where Tukhugov has shined. If you look at Hakeem Dawodu, the thing with him was, man, this kid was such a blue chip prospect coming out of World Series. And then he loses that fight to Danny Henry. And you're like, what just happened there? Like, where's the ceiling for this guy? Well, since then he's won 4. Austin Arnett, big win. Kyle Bochniak, that big win over Hori, that big statement win where you get a finish and you get a performance bonus. That means a lot. And then he has that split decision win over Julio Arce, which really makes you kind of scratch your head because really a win over Julio Arce does mean quite a bit. He's a good litmus test in that 25 to 30 mark in a loaded division of featherweight. So it is a good win for Dawodu. And I think odds makers really taking all of that into effect and seeing the fact that this is a pick'em fight. If you look over in Tapology at 919 votes, 58% going Tukhugov, 72 by decision. I think all of that odds and fan vote put together really giving some shine to the Canadian in Hakeem Dawodu. So in terms of a total pick here, Matt, this is actually, I know, again, it's easy to say because pick'em odds, this and that, flip of a coin. It is one of the tougher fights to try and predict. What do you make of this one here?
So I do think Dawodu is probably going to be able to get it done just because, like I said, I think on the feet, the power advantage definitely goes with him. And it's not like his power fades as the fight goes on. He himself might kind of lower his output as the fight goes on. But if those same shots land in the first round that land in the third round, they're still going to put you down. I think Tukhugov, that win over Renato Moicano is a really weird one because you look at Moicano and kind of the highs that he's had in the UFC. Like this guy beat Calvin Kattar, and the fight wasn't even close at all when they fought. But he also has a loss to Zubaira Tukhugov. So it's really weird, and it's really hard to say where Tukhugov is when you just think of him as a talent at 145. I think Dawodu is going to be able to get it done, but I do think these are two guys who they'll probably have a rematch kind of further along when both of them are, further in their career. Because I do think Tukhugov, he won't be ranked. He might not, become champ, but I think he's going to be a guy who's around for a while. And Dawodu, with his fighting style, when he fights other really high-level strikers, he might get clipped. He might go down at a certain point. But if you keep on giving him guys who are just kind of well-rounded, he's going to be able to strike the majority of them and keep on putting on fairly exciting fights.
I think this is really interesting because Hakeem Dawodu, if you look at it, 85% takedown defense. He hasn't shot for takedowns in the UFC, but he does have that. the one thing that makes me worry, you win a split decision where you totally outstrike Kyle Bochniak, but Bochniak takes you down. Kyle Bochniak doesn't take people down. So that's the thing that makes me worry. Then again, that was 2 years ago, and you're talking about
that shouldn't have been a split decision either. Like, he beat the brakes off Kyle Bochniak.
You look at it, and for Zubaira Tukhugov, huge periods of inactivity, or one major period of inactivity, coupled with the fact that he had the draw against Lerone Murphy that was whatever it was, and then he beat Kevin Aguilar and finished him. So yeah, maybe you get a bit of a question mark. Again, I'm sure that's why the odds are where they're at. And I'm going to have to side in this fight with Zubaira Tukhugov, again, due to the fact that there's so many different ways that he can win the fight. And if he's able to somehow take Hakeem Dawodu down to the mat, I think he has a huge advantage there. Again, takedown defense is on the side of Dawodu, but it's how long can he defend that takedown? I think Tukhugov just shoots. And I think, you're having a fight over in Abu Dhabi. That also favors him as well. So I think this is definitely the fight for Zubaira Tukhugov. We're going to disagree with our picks. I think this is the first fight on the card that we have so far up. I'm going with Zubaira Tukhugov. You're going with me and Hakeem Dawodu, the Canadian. And Matt, it's kind of weird. We haven't been picking Canadians lately. So, oh boy, you got one. I'm really looking forward to this entire card. We get an extended look at Jan Blachowicz and Dominick Reyes. And in our main event, Israel Adesanya taking on Paulo Costa. You're not going to want to miss that. You're going to want to keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, Matt. And as we always say, let's get into it. All right, Matt, next fight on our UFC 253 main card, a fight that I'm really looking forward to. At women's bantamweight, we got Ketlen Vieira taking on Sijara Eubanks. And Matt, all of a sudden, Sijara Eubanks, with a few really tidy wins, has inserted herself at the top of this division. She's really pining for a title shot. And I mean, who can really stop her at this point? I mean, Irene Aldana is going to have something to say. So is Holly Holm. And so is Ketlen Vieira. Matt, we can break this fight down in a whole bunch of different ways. But Sijara Eubanks, we talk about it every time she's out. She most likely, if she made weight in the finale of The Ultimate Fighter, probably would have won the inaugural women's flyweight title. I mean, yeah, maybe Nico Montano would have won, but Eubanks was obviously in that fight. The weight cut wasn't going well. Roxanne Modafferi took the fight, and that was pretty much history. And I know there was a point where Eubanks at 25, she was on all the big MMA shows, kind of really stating her case that she deserved a shot at the belt. Didn't happen for her. Weight cutting issues continued. She moved up to 35 and had a few pretty disappointing performances. And I say that just from the standpoint that they were losses. Now, the fight against Aspen Ladd, it was a loss, but I don't think it was all that disappointing. The fight against Betch Correia, oh boy, that's not that great. But all of a sudden, with a few really tidy wins, including the one against Julia Vila a couple of weeks ago, I mean, she looked amazing in that one. All three judges scored at 29-27. Something that you don't often see. Now, opposite her, you've got Ketlen Vieira, who we haven't seen in a number of months. She's been out for about 9 months since her first pro loss, that one against Irene Aldana. And I'll let you kind of touch on that one in a second, because it was a bit of a surprise. Vieira was obviously quite emotional after that fight. She was putting on a decent fight. She's putting on an exciting fight. Both women really going at it. You had Vieira pushing the pace, throwing, I wouldn't call them hooks, and I'm going to get into that a little later on, but throwing with a lot of power, really biting down on her mouthpiece, which was kind of a tell that Joe Rogan was going after as a bit of a commentary. Now, was it Khabib shouldn't be striking against Al Iaquinta, Joe Rogan? No, it wasn't. It wasn't that critical, but he was actually pointing out something that did ultimately become a difference maker for Aldana. And I mean, before that, undefeated 10 and 0 at the time. And you look at the fights that she had. So she went from Kelly Fashholtz, who it was a split decision win. Then she beats Ashley Evans Smith, really good fight. Then she beat Sarah McMahon, and then Kat Zingano by split decision. In that split decision to Kat Zingano, I went and checked it out on MMA Decisions. All 17 media members had scored it for Ketlen Vieira. There were 5 of them that scored at 29-28. There was quite a few that scored at 30-27. There were even a couple that scored at 30-26 for Vieira, if you can believe it. So split decisions aren't all created equal. Sometimes a judge just takes a round off, goes for a little bit of a snooze. So overall, really interesting fight. I'm going to let you kind of touch on that loss that Vieira had in her last time out. And maybe we got to give some shine to Sijara Eubanks. I say maybe, we definitely do, because that fight against Julia Vila, I know she was an underdog in that one. We had kind of seen it for Vila based on her striking and her jiu-jitsu. And I mean, ultimately, Sijara Eubanks pretty well nullified that with her wrestling.
Oh, yeah, Eubanks looked phenomenal. And with both these women, they kind of have the same problem. And it's at their best, they look like they could be potential title challengers. But then at their worst on the other side, you're like, ooh, do they even really belong in the top 10? Because you had mentioned with Sijara Eubanks, like, the Aspen Ladd loss, even if you want to call it a loss, I get it was, but I think it was just such a great fight against another really highly ranked fighter that, yes, you might have lost on your record, but the fight was really good. You put on a great performance, moving up in a weight class against one of the bigger 135ers. So I thought the future was really bright for Eubanks at 135. And then the Betch Correa fight happens, and yeah, that face is really the best way to sum it up. I mean, she got tired, she kind of faded as the fight went on. But in her last two fights, I mean, especially the Julia Avila one, we kind of counted her out. Avila, the much bigger fighter, someone who, not that they had a lot of hype behind them, but someone who you could see kind of potentially moving up those ranks a little bit. And Sijara Eubanks really solved a lot of those early problems that I thought she would have had going into that fight. She didn't have that massive kind of adrenaline dump and cardio fade as the fight went on. And if Sijara Eubanks can kind of keep her skill set throughout 3 hard rounds, she's going to be able to move forward in this division quite well. Because when you look at what she does, she's a pretty good boxer. She has good hand speed. She's very physically strong for the division, even though she comes in as slightly smaller than a lot of her opponents. But with Ketlen Vieira, this is someone who, if she had won that Arena Aldana fight, she'd probably be fighting for a title. I mean, that was kind of the conversation moving into that fight was, okay, let's say she goes out there, chokes out Aldana. It's okay, perfect. Ketlen Vieira is our next number 1 contender. Amanda Nunes, go for it. But she loses that fight, and it just really shuffled the whole division up because now Holly Holm may or may not be back in the title conversation for the 17th time, I guess. And we don't really know who is going to be that next solidified number 1 contender at 135. So if Ketlen Vieira can get this fight done, let's say she can get it to the ground, because Eubanks on the feet is going to have an advantage, but for Eubanks to really be at her best on the feet, she has to mix in her wrestling. But if she takes down Ketlen Vieira, you're really just playing into Vieira's game, because Vieira on the ground, pretty much second to none right now at that 135 division.
Which is really interesting. And this is where, you might think that this fight is a little bit of a clash of styles because Vieira, how good her jiu-jitsu is, but also her boxing is quite crisp. She has kind of a little bit of a long stance, a little flat-footed, but she throws with quite a bit of power. If you look over at her striking numbers, and it's a limited sample size, it is for kind of both fighters. But if you look at Vieira in particular, she only has the 5 UFC fights. It's a negative striking differential, 2.74 to 3.82. And that's not really what you want to see, especially with an accuracy of 35%. It's not great. It's not the worst. Opposite her for Sijara Eubanks, positive numbers, 4.71 to 3.14, and a better accuracy and better defense. So I would agree with you there. They strike in different ways. You typically see Sijara Eubanks really stringing together a lot of combinations, really getting in tight and pushing the pace. Vieira can kind of do it from distance a little bit more. She is the longer fighter. She's going to have a little bit in terms of reach and quite a bit in terms of height. The other thing, though, and this is what a lot of people are probably going to point to, so we're not unique here, is the fact that how good of a wrestler Sijara Eubanks is. But in her back pocket, she has that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, and she's really been able to hone in on a lot of the good qualities of her game. Not that there's really many bad ones. I mean, you look at her record, and it's not the best, but she definitely is bantamweight caliber type of fighter at the highest level. So how good her jiu-jitsu can be. How good her wrestling is. You saw it against Julia Avila, and she didn't get submitted in that fight, so kudos to her. On the flip side, though, people might not talk about it, but Ketlen Vieira is a Brazilian jiu-jitsu black belt. She's a judo black belt. She's a Brazilian national wrestling champion. So I'm not privy to how good the wrestling is in women's bantamweight terms, in terms of like what we have in Brazil. But I can tell you that if you go look at Ketlen Vieira and her entire body of work, the fight against Evan Smith, the fight against Zingano, and most specifically the fight against Sarah McMahon, Ketlen Vieira has a 92% takedown defense, which is great. Zingano tried to take her down, couldn't do it. Ashley Evans Smith tried to do it, and Sarah McMahon's the only one that was able to do it. I think she went 1 of 5 out of all of her takedowns. Now, that one was in the first round. She got Vieira down and stayed on top of her for the majority of the round. At the end of it, Vieira went for a little bit of a toe hold, if you could call it that. And Joe Rogan said something, again, I got to give him shine in that fight too. He said, Sarah McMahon looks pretty lost right now. Like, she looked totally fish out of water in that fight, which is something that Matt, like, we talk about it and we're going to bring it up in the next fight. I know we will, but the Luis Smolka effect. And Sarah McMahon is a prime fighter like that. So in the second round, McMahon goes into clinch up with Vieira. Vieira switches position and throws McMahon down to the ground. She's on top, and I swear to you, Sarah McMahon looked total deer in the headlights. And from there, Vieira goes in for the head and arm, or that's at least what she was going for. Joe Rogan says, she's kind of in the wrong spot for that. It's not really going to work out for her. Gets in the arm triangle and it's lights out, or it's the end of the fight. So Ketlen Vieira, big win there. And like you had said too, she was a second-ranked women's bantamweight when she fought Irene Aldana. Holy smokes. Like, that's crazy to think. And now we're here at a point where Ketlen Vieira is about a minus 175 favorite. You've got Sijara Eubanks at a plus 155 underdog. And out of 953 total votes on Tapology, 78% going Vieira, 81% predicting she wins by decision. Are you a fan of the odds? Because I have to lay my cards on the table. I'm fine with them. I think they make sense. The layoffs, though, that's the thing. Because for Ketlen Vieira, her last win over Kat Zingano was 2.5 years ago.
Exactly. And it's hard to justify being a minus 170 when your biggest win was over 2 years ago. But you look at what she does well, and because Sijara Eubanks' game plan should play right into Vieira's skill set. Because, again, if Eubanks takes her down, or if she's even able to take her down or going for the takedown, we know the reversals of Vieira are really good. Those hip throws, those different changes of direction. And if she can get on top of Eubanks really any period during this fight, it's going to be the biggest advantage that either person could have. So I don't know if I'd bet on this one just because Eubanks, I would say, is a fairly live dog, but I do think Ketlen Vieira should be able to get it done.
Yeah, I mean, we talk quite a bit about Ketlen Vieira, but for Sijara Eubanks, like I said, the switch and the camp in New Jersey with Mark Henry's, that's perfect for your game. And I'm thinking of some of the fighters, the two main that come off the top of my head, your two-time PFL champ in Lance Palmer and your former UFC lightweight champ in Frankie Edgar. Those are two pretty good people to at least have in the same gym to kind of learn from, especially in the lower weight classes. Sijara Eubanks definitely has a chance in this fight. I'm going to side, though, with Ketlen Vieira. I think it's one of those fights where if she can really string together the striking, that she's a Nova União fighter. She's going to have Pederneiras in her corner. I think it's going to work out in her favor. This is a really high-level fight at women's bantamweight, Matt. We're both going with, Julia Villa. No, I'm just kidding. We're both going with Ketlen Vieira to get the win in this one. Make sure you keep locked in with Fight Night Picks. We got an extended look at our main and co-main for the titles. Adesanya taking on Costa, as well as Jan Blachowicz taking on a really tough out in Dominick Reyes. Keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, Matt. And as we always say, let's get into it. We have to say this every single time. This on our main card of UFC 253, and flyweights never die, as we have Kai Kara-France representing City Kickboxing. And no, he's not the first City Kickboxing fighter on this card, and he won't be the last. And he's taken on a really tough out in Brandon Royval. And Matt, Royval, coming out of Factory X, really impressed in a short notice UFC debut against Tim Elliott. And I'm going to let you take over from here because we have a little term that we use with Fight Night Picks, and you used it in that prediction for the Royval-Elliott fight. I'm pretty sure we both had picked Brandon Royval to get the win. Lo and behold, Brandon Royval gets the win. But what exactly happened in that fight?
Well, Tim Elliott basically just got ragdolled, and we had no idea how good Brandon Royval was. That's really, I can honestly say that was my prediction going into that fight, because Tim Elliott, you know what you're going to get. There's those crazy scrambles, but with those crazy scrambles, he exerts a lot of energy. So if you can just kind of outlast him and keep the fight at a high pace for sure, but just keep on flowing, keep on scrambling, and kind of play into his game, you can wear him out. And the fact that Brandon Royval not only was able to outstrike, out wrestle, and out grapple Tim Elliott, I think that was the most important part of that fight, because Tim Elliott, he's just good at everything. So it's really hard to be better than him at everything. Sometimes you might be better than him at striking, but he has the wrestling edge, or you might be better at wrestling, but he has the striking edge. The fact that Brandon Royval went out there on short notice and was able to kind of put everything together, get him in that beautiful arm triangle, it was just really impressive to go there on short notice, beat a grappler with a submission like that. And Kai Kara-France, who we've mentioned it a few times, how it's better when a guy comes into the UFC who has a bit of a salty record, but at least the guys who they fought were a high caliber outside of the UFC. And Kai Kara-France is a pretty good example of that.
So let me go down through that list, because there might be some people that you might not recognize, but in his sixth pro fight, he took on Danilo Batgarel, that we now know in the UFC. I mean, he's 1-1, but had a great knockout win over Guido Canetti here somewhat recently. He lost to Haile Alatang in his debut. He's got a fight against Mark Striegel, who was supposed to be coming in and fighting Timur Valiev not that long ago. Striegel out, but I'm sure we'll see him in the UFC sometime soon. So there's another one you go up through. He lost to Alexandre Pantoja over on The Ultimate Fighter. Then he went from that fight over to Risen, whatever you may say, and lost to Tatsumitsu Wada, who you might not recognize, but if you know Tatsumitsu, he had a fight against Demetrius Johnson over with one championship, and it was incredibly competitive. So if you go down through that, Rodolfo Marques, there's another one. And then you look at his run so far in the UFC, beats Elias Garcia, beats Raulian Paiva, controversial split decision, beats Mark De La Rosa. Okay, that's probably going to happen. Loses to the Assassin Baby, who I had said is probably going to be the champ at flyweight before the end of the year.
But that hype train.
Listen, it's unfortunate because you might have Cody Garbrandt as your champ before the end of the year. So 2021 is the year of Brandon Moreno, even though 2020 has been pretty good to him. And then you look at Kai Kara-France, and he picks up a big win over Tyson Nam in his last fight. And you might think Tyson Nam at that point was kind of a throwaway. Like, you lose to Pettis, you lose to Kai Kara-France. Well, what's left for you? Look at his last 2 wins. And I know they're not against the best competition, but Tyson Nam looking pretty darn good over Jerome Rivera and Zaruk Adeshev. So for a win, or to have a win over Tyson Nam, and I mean, yeah, it was back in February, that definitely holds quite a bit of water. Now, he was booked against Alex Perez back in May. That event obviously canceled. So now you drop Brandon Royval. And this is where it gets really interesting because the pedigree of jiu-jitsu certainly lies in the corner of Royval. But in this one, it's so interesting because Kai Kara-France, he's kind of like that Tim Elliott 2.0. He's good in the scrambles. He's half decent at wrestling. You know how good his striking is, especially representing City Kickboxing. I'm sure they have bad strikers there. You gotta put lipstick on a pig sometimes. But in terms of this overall fight, I think it should be highly competitive. And with Brandon Royval, you're talking strength of schedule and the opponents that he's faced on the regional scene in the States. They haven't been all that bad. One name that I've already mentioned, Tyson Nam's last opponent, Jerome Rivera. Brandon Royval has a win over him, although you can't really call it a win because Rivera fell backwards and broke his fall by breaking his elbow. But apart from that, win over Joby Sanchez, win over Nate Williams, had a lot of success on the regional scene. And then again, that win over Tim Elliott in a fight where he looked quite good. And it has been a little bit since we've seen him just over 3 months ago, bridging on 4 months. Overall, Matt, in terms of ceilings for both of these guys, and I know this kind of strays away from the prediction side of things, do you think either one of these guys is top 10, top 5 material in the UFC?
I mean, I'm pretty sure whoever wins this will just automatically be in the top 10 because flyweight has about 12 fighters right now. But I think Kai Kara-France can be around for a while. He has a skill set kind of similar to an Ian Heinisch. You would mention kind of that Tim Elliott 2.0 where just kind of good at everything. And yes, he comes from City Kickboxing, so you would assume kind of his striking would be the highlight of his skill set. And he has good strikes, but he's another one of these guys who he's much more of a mixed martial artist than a kickboxer who is now an MMA fighter because he will go for the takedown. He's got really nice takedown defense. Good cardio too. He's always got that sort of just going forward. He kind of stays in the 7 throughout the fight. There's never this big dump in his output. There's never a big increase in his output as the fight goes on. Just kind of stays this constant. And the key to this fight is defend the takedowns of Brandon Royval. If Kai Kara-France can keep it on the feet, he's the much more technical guy on the feet. He has the better cardio, especially in the striking department. So for Kai Kara-France, if you can keep this fight on the feet, I really don't see how he loses.
And I mean, if you're Brandon Royval, you get that on the mat, it could certainly be lights out incredibly quickly. We know how slippery this guy is on the ground. Now, if we look over at the odds, Kai Kara-France open to minus 185. That line dropped about 20 points incredibly quickly, and now it's tapered off as the week's gone on. So he's a minus 238 according to best fight odds. If you look over at Brandon Royval, open to plus 160. It dropped, it went up, it moved around. He's a plus 190 at this point. And if you look over on Tapology to the total votes, 1,063, 77% have it for Kai Kara-France, 87% have it for decision. Now, I had said when Brandon Royval fought Tim Elliott, if you go back into the archives, I believe we had both picked Brandon Royval to win that fight as the underdog. So pat on the back, Matt. I don't have the Fight Night Pick'em trophy here with me abroad. I know I'm way ahead, so what does it even matter, right? No, I'm just kidding. But in terms of this fight, I'm definitely going to side with the favorite, and I think he's certainly going to be able to get it done. If he's able to win out in the scrambles, if he's able to keep it at least on the feet, he has a decided advantage there, and it should be a breeze to a decision win. But again, Brandon Royval gets to the ground. Pretty good shot. He's gonna leave with a limb.
Yeah, I just think Kai Kara-France kind of has the counter to everything Brandon Royval brings. Because Royval has that jiu-jitsu, but I'd say Kai Kara-France definitely has the better wrestling out of the two. So if Royval, he's going to have to drop Kara-France to really be able to use the best part of his skill set, and I don't see that happening. So Kai Kara-France by decision is a pretty safe bet.
Matt, I'm really looking forward to this fight. We both have Kai Kara France to get the win. You're going to want to keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, Matt, because you know what's next. We've got Jan Blachowicz taking on Dominick Reyes for the vacant UFC light heavyweight title. We also have Israel Adesanya looking to hold on to his middleweight crown against Paulo Costa as I lose an earbud. So keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, Matt, as we always say. Let's get into it. Matt, so it seems that John Bones Jones decided to go the way of Eddie in the song Into the Great Wide Open by Tom Petty, because Eddie waited till he finished high school. He went to Hollywood, got a tattoo. He met a girl there with a tattoo too. The future was wide open. And as the chorus of that song goes, into the great wide open, into the skies of blue, and so on and so forth. And John Jones decided that it was time to go to greener and larger pastures. So he's moved up to heavyweight. He's vacated his title. And all of a sudden, one of the things that we like to harp on at Fight Night Picks is you don't deserve a title shot with a loss. But I'll tell you who does. It's Dominick Reyes and maybe Thiago Santos. But Dominick Reyes is going to be taking on Jan Blachowicz. And Matt, I'm really excited about this fight because this is one of the better fights on the card. I can certainly see it deliver. And it's one of those ones where either guy can definitely have a path to victory and either guy can finish his opponent. It's not one of those ones where it's going to be a sleeper. It's going to be a boring fight. This one should certainly deliver. Now, I might end up eating my words late Saturday night, but here's hoping that the Devastator coming off that loss against John Jones, a lot of people saw the fight for him. Now, what makes it interesting in the Thiago Santos reference that I made is Santos had a win over Jan Blachowicz. Santos also lost that fight to Jones by split decision, whereas Dominick Reyes lost by unanimous decision. Now, we can argue till the cows come home in the pastures of the great wide open, but I thought that John Jones won that fight. I know that might seem somewhat controversial, but I did see it 3-2 for Jones. Now, in terms of the fights that Dominick Reyes has put on up until that point, the one fight that really concerned me was the fight over or against Volkan Oezdemir. I had seen that fight Oezdemir's way, but there's a lot of things that Dominick Reyes does well that can counter Jan Blachowicz. I just want to get this out of the way right now. If you're a big fan of Jan Blachowicz and you're really in the corner because he had the knockout win over Luke Rockhold, he had a knockout over Beaston 25-8 Corey Anderson, Bellator's own in his last fight out, you might want to go back and pay special attention to the fight that he had against Jacare Souza, because that fight was actually a lot closer than just a W on a record. It was probably one of the most boring fights. You might want to watch it on 2-speed. But the problem in that one was Blachowicz wasn't really able to get into his rhythm. And he's a really odd fighter, not just in the way that he carries himself, not the fact that he's a 37-year-old former KSW light heavyweight champ who has a win and a loss to Sokaju. He's a really interesting cat in the cage because his jiu-jitsu is on point. He's a Brazilian jiu-jitsu black belt. His striking, very sneaky. He can check leg kicks. He can throw leg kicks. He can throw to the body. He throws wonderful hooks. These are some of the best hooks in MMA, and there's a ton of power behind them. And there's a lot of people that say, well, you know, you knock out Corey Anderson, you knock out Luke Rockhold, you don't really have any knockout power. Whoa, easy does it. This guy can certainly beat the best light heavyweights on any given day, and he has an opportunity to do it here. So, Matt, I kind of focused on both of these guys. I'm really excited about this fight. Take this where you want to go, but please don't make another Tom Petty reference.
I won't. Don't worry. Light heavyweight's in a really fun place right now just because you finally have the king is gone, and there's about 6 or 7 contenders who all seem to be around the same level. Guys like Glover, guys like Thiago, Dominick Reyes, Jan Blachowicz. Like, it's a fairly talent-rich division, and some of that talent is now going to flourish because you have such a dominant champion removed from the picture. So I think we're going to have a revolving door of title or of champions in this division, just because I think Dominick Reyes might be a little bit better than some of these other guys, or Jan Blachowicz might be better, but stylistically, they all kind of match up well with each other. And I think what'll really come down to just the matchups. Maybe Thiago Santos could beat Dominick Reyes, but Jan Blachowicz can beat Thiago in a rematch. Like, I think we are going to get a little bit of parity in this weight class for a while now. Dominick Reyes on paper has a lot of advantages over Jan Blachowicz, though. He's bigger, he's faster. I'd say he hits a little bit harder strike for strike. And you look at the evolution of Dominick Reyes' striking. Dan Hardy was talking about this in his breakdown of this fight. It's that when you look at some of the shots and some of his techniques from early on in his career, you can kind of see them being replicated as his career's progressed. And it's just kind of a cleaner, more crisp version. He's got that really nice kind of pullback left hand. He used it on Chris Weidman. And I know using it on Chris Weidman's one thing and Jan Blachowicz is another. But still, it's the technique itself, not really who it was used against. And he's really refined some of those better ones in his arsenal. if he first of all, Dominick Reyes, quit talking about how good you were at sports in high school. That's weird. Like, you're wicked at MMA. You have other accomplishments to go back to. I don't really care about you losing like a high school football game, but that's just a little side note.
All
Jan
state, bro.
Blachowicz, oh yeah, settle down. So Jan Blachowicz is just weird because I couldn't really tell you how he wins a lot of his fights. Like, you watch him, and what he does is not to say basic, but it kind of is. He throws hooks, he throws leg kicks. He doesn't seem to be the fastest. He doesn't really seem to hit the hardest. He doesn't have like Rumble Johnson-esque power. But when he lands on people, like Luke Rockhold doesn't have a great chin, but the punch that Blachowicz landed on him, that like long left hook coming out of the clinch, it looked like he got shot by a shotgun, Luke Rockhold. Like, he went down hard. And the follow-up shots were great. Now, you bring up the Jacare fight, and I think it's an important fight to bring up. But I think you kind of have to just take Jan Blachowicz' word for it. He said he was really tentative because he didn't want to let his hands go and potentially get taken down because Jacare is such a dangerous guy. And if he got to opposition on Jan Blachowicz, yes, Jan is a black belt in jiu-jitsu, but there's levels with being a black belt in jiu-jitsu and being Jacare Souza. And I think
that's something that Corey Anderson tried to exploit because there's levels, but it didn't work for him.
Yeah, and the Corey Anderson fight, I was worried for Jan going into that fight because their first fight, Corey Anderson beat the brakes off him. I mean, he kept a pace up that Jan couldn't deal with. He took him down multiple times. But I thought Jan made a lot of really nice adjustments going into that rematch, and I think that shows the evolution of his career. Yeah, he's 36, 37, but it's not like he's stopped getting better. Every fight, every performance, we keep on seeing him getting better, getting better. And after the Thiago Santos loss, I thought, okay, this is probably it for Jan Blachowicz. Like, that was his last run. But even at this stage in his career, he's still putting out really exciting and really great performances against the top level guys at 205.
And who would have thought it? I mean, you look at Jan Blachowicz' record, and to start off 2-4, the losses to Jimmy Manuwa, Corey Anderson, Alexander Gustafsson, and Pat Cummins. And that was the start. And since then, he's gone 7-1. The one loss to Thiago Santos. I mean, the hammer. That's going to happen. But the wins, Devin Clark, Jared Cannonier. Cannonier at light heavyweight, maybe not as good as Cannonier at middleweight.
Still pretty
beats
good.
Beats Manuwa in the rematch. Beats Krylov by submission. That's not that easy. Look at Nikita Krylov. And that guy's a submission specialist and a really streaky fighter. Beats Rockhold, beats Jacare, and then beats Anderson in the first round. Calls out John Jones. Seemed like that was going to happen back at Rio Rancho. It did not. And that was right after John Jones had fought Dominick Reyes in a fight that was incredibly controversial, albeit a win by unanimous decision. So kind of focus a little bit on both of these fighters. We look at Dominick Reyes too, and I mean, I had mentioned that win that he had over Volkan Oezdemir, but he also knocked out Jared Cannonier. He also had a good fight against Ovince St. Preux, the split decision to Oezdemir, and the knockout over Weidman, which was, what are we doing here? Like, sad. Really, that's at that point, that's what you needed for a title shot. Now you just need a loss, right? There's an ode to the earlier portion of the video. Now, if we look at this fight in terms of the odds, are you at all surprised that you have such a favorite in Dominick Reyes? He opened a minus 200. That line's dropped to minus 284. I don't like that. I mean, this is a guy that, again, he's fought, I would say at this point, no time Volkan Oezdemir. He's pretty well a power puncher, and that's kind of the game plan. You kind of figured out what he's going to do pretty well every time out. He beat him, but, it leaves more to be desired. Exactly. But Dominick Reyes did put on such a good performance against John Jones. How big of a decline is John Jones on? We have to ask those questions now because he's not hanging out at the top of the light heavyweight division. He's chasing legacy fights at heavyweight. So you disagree with these odds?
I do, because it's hard to justify being a 3-1 favorite over a guy who's won, like you said, 7 of his last 8 when your best performance came in a loss. Now, yes, it was against arguably the greatest fighter of all time, but it's a guy who has looked somewhat human, I'd say, since he came back after the second DC fight, because he beat Gustafsson, but that's an older Gustafsson who hadn't fought in a while. Then he beats Anthony Smith, and then he beats Thiago Santos and Dominick Reyes. Like, those last 3 guys, I wouldn't say are really on the same level historically of some of the other 3 fight stretches that John Jones has gone on. It doesn't really, add up to the Rampages, the DCs, like the Glovers. There's better guys out there that he has fought and that he's looked a lot better against. I think Dominick Reyes should be respected and should be the favorite in this fight, but he shouldn't be a borderline 3-1 favorite because Jan Blachowicz, he's a really smart fighter. Like you had mentioned, checks leg kicks too. That was a problem for him early in his career. And in the Luke Rockhold fight, you really saw it because every time Luke Rockhold threw a kick, he would just check. And Luke Rockhold would have to switch stances, and then he just kind of stopped throwing the leg kick at one point because Jan Blachowicz would make him pay for it every time. And Jan won't only make you pay for it by checking. He'll let you hit some of those leg kicks and then punish you with power and kind of leap in with punches. He's got kind of that stiff way of striking, which always gets me a little concerned when he is fighting those upper echelon strikers, because we saw in the Thiago Santos fight, they were just kind of going 50-50 for a lot of it. And Jan, it just seemed like he was always expecting Thiago Santos to do something big in that fight, because that's what Thiago Santos does. So he kind of wait and wait and wait. And when Thiago Santos was just kind of countering, Jan decided, okay, I'm going to go forward, rushes forward, and then Thiago Santos backing up, hits him with like an overhead left and knocks him out. I don't see that happening in this fight. I do see Dominick Reyes kind of being the one bringing the fight to Jan Blachowicz. And that's the best version of the fight that we're going to get, because Dominick Reyes at his best is the enforcer. He's using his size. He's kind of using his physical presence to bully Jan Blachowicz around the cage. But Jan, as a counter striker, that's really where his game's going to open up, and he's going to get the most out of it. Because if Dominick Reyes is pushing forward, and we saw with the John Jones fight, if you think he won, then yes, he won the first 3 rounds. If you think he lost, or then he won the first 2 rounds. But he did fade at that as that fight went on. And yes, fading against John Jones is one thing. Fading against Jan Blachowicz and the outputs the both guys are going to be able to keep up. But even if you think Dominick Reyes is better than Jan, at a certain point in that fight, I do think cardio makes it about a 50-50 fight. So I don't – this is more tying into the odds. I don't think Dominick Reyes should be respected as 3-1 favorite.
Okay, so I do like the respect. Now, Matt, I pose this question in the Fight Night Picks community tab over on YouTube. So if you're watching this, you can head over there and vote as well. We've got almost as many votes as there are on Tapology. So I'm going to go off the Fight Night Picks numbers for this one. So I put it out there, full card preview, set to drop on Tuesday night, fingers crossed, late Tuesday night. Who's going to get the win? 73% going Reyes out of 749 votes. And I'm going to go through a couple of the comments, because Akash Deep is a guy that's been following us for quite some time. So shout out to Western Canada. He says, I honestly think Jan takes it. Reyes seems overconfident from the Jones performance, and I feel like Jan knows he's getting up there in age and wants to win the title. I see Jan finish. There's another one by Kyle OM who says, I picked against Jan for his last 3, 4, even 5 fights, and I'm done with that Polish power. So it seems like there's a lot of people going with Jan Blachowicz. And as I go through, it's Jan. And one that's Reyes destroys Blachowicz, TBH. Reyes and Kara France is amazing pair of picks there. So with that, all that being said, I look at this from a couple of different angles, and I bring up that Jacare fight because I really think that it does hold water. You don't have to worry about Dominick Reyes to really bring this fight down to the ground. The guy's takedown accuracy, 16% through this point. It's one of those things where you're not going to take down a guy that's so credentialed a grappler. So that's probably not going to happen. But I do like the takedown defense number at 82% for Reyes. I don't really see Jan Blachowicz fishing. Maybe he does and tries to expend the cardio of Reyes. But I think Reyes is probably going to be able to keep it standing with the length that he has and the defensive wrestling that he has. In terms of the striking differential, that's a number that I always bring up. It's a positive 1.88 for Dominick Reyes. It's a positive 0.68 for Jan Blachowicz. And that speaks to the counters and the boxing of Dominick Reyes versus maybe some of those single and more power shots that you're going to get from Jan Blachowicz. So you like the countering of Blachowicz. You like the leg checks. I think Dominick Reyes, as this fight goes forward, it's going to favor Reyes a little bit more. I think he's probably shored up a few of those holes in his game that we saw against John Jones. And Jan Blachowicz and John Jones are definitely not the same fighters. So I don't see 37-year-old Jan Blachowicz, as it gets into a 4th and 5th round, really just his cardio going, like he's not Kamaru Usman in rounds 4 and 5. I don't see that happening. I see this the way of Dominick Reyes. And it's going to be interesting because if Reyes wins, there's a rematch right there you can set up with John Jones if anything happens down the road, or maybe have him fight Thiago Santos. If Blachowicz wins, you got plenty of rematches that you can make, probably with Thiago Santos. So, Matt, I'm really looking forward to this one. And I've got Reyes, so let me hear your pick here.
So if 2020 wasn't crazy enough, I'm about to really say the words, I think Jan Blachowicz is going to be the UFC light heavyweight champion this year. And again, am I that confident with the pick? Not really. I don't know if you can tell by the way that I said it. But I do think he just has a lot of the intangibles that Dominick Reyes doesn't, sheerly due to his experience. He's fought for the KSWs. He's fought high-level competitions in the past. He's been champion in the past.
Twice.
Yeah, exactly. Sokoju at one point was a bit of a problem. So Jan Blachowicz has the experience factor. I think in the clinch where this fight's going to find itself, I think Jan Blachowicz has really nice damaging shots. He's got good elbows. Again, we saw that in the Rockhold fight. And he's good at making you pay for entering and exiting the clinch. And I think that's the position this fight's going to be in quite a bit. So I just think Jan Blachowicz does a lot of the little things that are going to get this fight won for him. And yeah, I'm picking Jan Blachowicz to be the light heavyweight champion.
Well, regardless of who you go with, Matt, it's going to be and new on Saturday night. I'm going with Dominick Reyes. You're going with Jan Blachowicz. I'm really looking forward to this card. Make sure you stay tuned for a main event pick, an extended look at Israel Adesanya, looking to keep his title, taking on Paulo Borrachinha Costa, the Eraser. Matt, great playlist, great fights on this card. Let's keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, Matt. And as we always say, let's get into it. It is finally time for our main event of the evening for the UFC middleweight title, Matt. I'm really looking forward to this fight. We have two incredibly great strikers. Israel Adesanya looking to keep his middleweight title, taking on Paulo the Eraser Costa. And Matt, there's a lot of people right now that are incredibly high on Khamzat Chimaev. I read somewhere on the internet today, there's a possibility that in Chimaev's next fight, he's probably going to highlight a Fight Night card, which is absolutely insane. He's undefeated. He's only had 3 fights in the UFC. Hold the phone, because there was another middleweight that is still undefeated, and there was a ton of shine around and was kind of like Khamzat Chimaev 1.0, if you want to call him. It's Paulo Costa. And Paulo Costa at this point in his career, 13-0. I remember the guy with the slim shady hair on The Ultimate Fighter Brazil that went in there against Marcio Alessandre and lost a split decision. You remember how that fight went? Because Paulo Costa looked good in the first round, taking the fight to the ground. He was on Alessandre's back. In the second round, trying to take it to the ground. In the third round, Paulo Costa was so tired that he got knocked over by a jab and like sent flying and could barely get back up to his feet just because of exhaustion. So he loses that one by split decision. You think this guy's never going to amount to diddly squat in the UFC. Comes in, he's taking on, run-of-the-mill guys. Gareth McLennan in his debut 3.5 years ago. One of Matt's favorite fighters in Olawale Bamboje. In the next fight, he gets a knockout win. Then it's Big Rig Johnny Hendricks in a fight where Big Rig never should have been in that fight. That was insane. Great card, UFC 217, but that fight was just silly. Then he fights Uriah Hall in a fight that I know we're going to talk about. So spoiler, that fight's going to come up a lot because Uriah Hall and Israel Adesanya, I'm not saying they're really similar, but Uriah Hall fights long and has quite good kickboxing, and he's never really lived up to his potential like Israel Adesanya does. But Uriah Hall on his best day is certainly a middleweight contender. Look at the first fight that he had against a really tough out in the Moose, and we just have to leave it where it is there. And then again in Costa's last fight against Uriah Hall, Yoel Romero, an all-timer, where Paulo Costa looked amazing. He kept pushing forward. He was just throwing absolute fire. Now you look at Israel Adesanya, also undefeated, former Glory kickboxer, training at a City Kickboxing. He is the 4th City Kickboxing fighter on this card. You got Shane Young, Brad Riddell, you've got Kai Kara-France, and then Adesanya at the top. Eugene Behrman is taken over, just like DJ Khaled. But in this fight, Israel Adesanya, since he's became the champion, since he beat Robert Whittaker, I mean, that fight against Yoel Romero, maybe don't go back and watch that one, because that was not the best version of. Yeah, it was. I mean, for Adesanya, keeps the title. That's great. I mean, Tyron Woodley kept his title for a long time. People didn't like the way that he fought, but he fought smart. Adesanya fought a smart fight, and he kept his title against a really difficult opponent, whereas Paulo Costa went absolute balls to the wall and threw everything that he could against Yoel Romero and picked up a really good win. Probably should have got a title shot earlier, but just due to injuries and this and that, wasn't able to do it. So in this fight, 2 primary strikers that strike in totally different ways. One guy that, again, throws everything into his shots. He could probably use Trevor Whitman a little bit sometimes, and I'm going to bring that up a little bit later as well. But Matt, I love this fight. It's such a good matchup. Paulo Costa is one of the weirdest people on Twitter. And I have to say that if you've never seen him, if you've never seen him on Twitter, please go check it out, because it's incredibly strange, quite derogatory, and ultimately mildly entertaining. And he really was pining for this fight. Now he's got it. So overall, I mean, what's your excitement level for this fight?
It's at an 11 out of 10. Just if you didn't know anything about MMA and you saw this fight poster on like Fight Circus, it would make sense to you because you have this one guy who's just really tall and thin, and the other guy looks like he should be in like a bodybuilding competition. But Israel Adesanya is just such a high level striker. And you think, okay, there's no other guys on his level striking in the UFC. It's not like Paulo Costa, some scrub who only throws big punches. He's not kind of that 2002, New York badass, your boy.
There's nothing wrong with
his name. Phil Baroni, thank you. He's not just Phil Baroni who's going to go in there and just throw really hard, kind of get tired, and then we'll see where the fight goes. He's got really good technique, goes to the body a lot, which you don't see in MMA enough nowadays. Because Paulo Costa, his best position is if he can back you up against the cage, he does cut the cage off really well. He doesn't just follow his opponent around. And if he can cut you off, we saw it in the Yoel fight. Now, yes, Yoel was kind of inviting him to sort of push forward, but when he gets you up and he starts throwing those big hooks to the body and then the overhands, it's so overwhelming for the opponent up against the cage that, yeah, Yoel was able to survive, but that guy probably has one of the best chins in MMA history. And we see what happens to everyone else when they kind of eat that onslaught from Paulo Costa. There's really not much they can do. But Adesanya, in all that chaos, I think he will be able to find some openings, because if you have a guy just crashing forward, throwing these big hooks, leaving himself open, I think it's the perfect recipe for Adesanya. Clinch up Anderson Silva, Rich Franklin style, and just start throwing tinies to the body, to the head, elbows, because Adesanya is an 80-inch reach, I believe, and I think Costa is at 72. So with an 8-inch reach advantage, if you think Uriah Hall is going to have a lot of success with the jab and kind of his longer range weapons, amplify that by 2-3-fold, just because Adesanya technically is on another level from Uriah Hall, who is already a phenomenal striker. Plus, he's got more physical attributes that are going to help him. He's got the reach, he's got the distance, he's got the leg reach. It's going to be a really hard night for Paulo Costa, but if we know anything about Paulo Costa, he's got good cardio, even though he's super huge and has a lot of muscle, which is kind of counterintuitive. He can throw a really high volume and keep that pace for a while. So both guys' strengths play into the other one's weaknesses, and that's why I'm so excited for this fight.
And I brought up the Marcio Alessandre fight that he had on The Ultimate Fighter. That was 6 years ago. He was 23 years old. And yeah, at the time, he gassed hard in the third round. In a 5-round fight still in 2020, I know Costa's fought a 5-rounder before, or sorry, he hasn't, I guess, so far in the UFC. But I definitely favor Adesanya in a longer fight, for sure. The stat that I really wanted to point out, and when you look on UFC stats, and we sometimes will say, well, with 2 or 3 fights, you can account for this guy or this gal's percentage because of who they fought. Paulo Costa's fought decent talent so far. I mean, he's gone all the way from Gareth McLennan to Yoel Romero in 5 fights. He actually holds a UFC record right now as it stands. So for strikes landed per minute, at number 3, you have Leslie Smith at 7.56. You ever watch a Leslie Smith fight? They're actually really entertaining. Whether she wins or loses, she will throw the kitchen sink at you. Bellator's finest in the bantamweight division. At number 2, Justin Gaethje, 7.74. Well, that makes sense. Paulo Costa, 8.43. That's absolutely insane, and it's a stat that I'm sure they'll throw at you as well on the broadcast. Israel Adesanya, for as good as he is, doesn't actually hold any UFC records. He's not there at all. So interesting stuff there. In terms of overall numbers, the striking differential slightly lies with Paulo Costa. His absorbed per minute is way higher. So if his given is 8.43, absorbed per minute 6.84, that's not good. That's really going to favor Adesanya in this fight. He's a very elusive guy, even with the fights against Anderson Silva and against Kelvin Gastelum, which, listen, that Silva fight was probably closer than it really needed to be, or anybody probably wanted it to be. I know it was Adesanya's, idol and one of the reasons why he got involved in MMA, but it's not great. But his absorbed per minute number, 2.4 to 3.96 given. It gives him strike differential of 1.56. In terms of takedowns, I don't really see either of these guys going for takedowns. Take it for what it's worth. Paulo Costa actually has a tidy little jiu-jitsu belt hidden in his back pocket. And again, Adesanya with kickboxing, it's one of those things that a lot of people are going to favor him in striking over Costa for that reason. But you brought up a really good point as well. It's a combination to the power for Costa and the fact that he has that strange staying power, which you don't normally see it as somebody that's incredibly muscled up. And I know we've talked about it before where Tyron Woodley, he fought to keep his belt maybe. Look at how muscled up Tyron Woodley was when he was a champion through his time in Strikeforce and coming up. He was always heavily muscled, and it wasn't like cardio was ever that big of an issue for him. So Paulo Costa all of a sudden finds a little bit of success in that regard. So we've got 2 totally different strikers. We've got two totally different sets of strikes given to taken, this and that. And jiu-jitsu, probably just throw that one out the door. You have guys that are going to throw at each other. Do you see this as Paulo Costa closing the gap, landing, and winning that belt? Or do you see Adesanya stick and move, looking like a boxer, in and out, and really finding success that way?
So I think the storyline that a lot of people are trying to write is that Paulo Costa is just going to go out there, and if he wins, it's going to be this one-punch knockout. Paulo Costa doesn't really one-punch knock people out. Like, yes, he's big, yes, he's strong, and he's a really good striker, but when you watch his fights, it's an accumulation. He fights in sort of that Max Holloway style. The terrifying thing
Johnny
is,
Hendricks fight.
yeah, like he was just landing overhand right and overhand right after overhand right on Johnny Hendricks, and I'm sure he hits really hard, but it is more of a volume thing with Paulo Costa than it is just a pure outright power. Adesanya has Kevin Holland's another guy who reminds me of this. He's got that deceiving power because he's got like a whip to his punches. He catches people right on the end of them, and you can just tell that it's the accuracy and the timing that really play into his game more than just the brute force of, okay, I'm going to walk you down, throw as hard as I can, and in that chaos, I'll see what I can pull from it. Adesanya, I think, is too high level of a striker to be caught up in one of those kinds of wars with Paulo Costa. We saw the Robert Whittaker fight. I think Robert Whittaker technically is better than Paulo Costa. We saw that in the Darren Till fight, just how high level sort of that kickboxing fight was. Robert Whittaker is almost impossible to outstrike. And Israel Adesanya just kind of went in there, downloaded everything Robert Whittaker was throwing at him, and just figured him out. And to beat someone of that caliber, and I hold Robert Whittaker really in high regard, if you can go out there and KO him, I don't see why you can't do the same to Paulo Costa. I think Costa leaves himself open to be hit. He's got a phenomenal chin. We saw that in the Yoel Romero fight. Yoel landed a flying knee. He landed massive shots on Costa. Costa just kept on moving forward. It's going to come down to cardio, though. And for as good of an output that Costa can keep up, I think he's going to really have to bring it back, pull those reins back, slow down a little bit and try to go strike for strike with Israel Adesanya. And then if you can hit him with a big shot that can wobble him, then sort of go for your combinations. If Paulo Costa kind of does what Justin Gaethje did, when Gaethje went from being that, I'm going to give one to land one, and now Gaethje's like, okay, I just hit harder than everybody. Why would I take all these unnecessary shots? If I'm just smarter, I can just go out there and one punch a lot of people. If Costa took that advice, like you had mentioned with Trevor Whitman, it would help him a lot moving forward because he has the skill set that, yes, technically he's probably not as good as Gaethje. He's not the wrestler. They have separate skill sets, but as just that brawling, move forward kind of guy, it is worth it to sort of down your output, up your power, and don't leave yourself open because you got to think every time you're throwing a strike, you're leaving a hand down to be hit. And I just think Adesanya is too high level. I've been going back watching a bunch of his kickboxing fights this week, and the fact that he's able to not only taunt but just like dismantle people and all they ever do is strike, it's really remarkable. So I don't know if anyone who is classified as a striker will be able to beat Adesanya at 185 for the time being.
And I mean, you look at the odds here. I'm actually surprised how close they are. Adesanya open a minus 140 favorite, now a minus 175. You look at Paulo Costa open as a plus 120, now at a plus 146. And if we go over on Tapology and look at the total votes at a 1200 exactly on the nose, 66% going Adesanya, 48% saying he's going to win by decision, 46% saying he's going to win by knockout, a slim margin saying he could submit Paulo Costa. I don't see that happening. I see Israel Adesanya holding on to his belt. Either a late TKO or more than likely a decision win for Adesanya. I think, again, the staying power is there. The proof's in the pudding in 5 rounders for Adesanya. We haven't seen it from Costa. We haven't seen him get overly tired in some time because normally he's just pummeling the F out of all of his opponents. But I see it in this fight. Yeah, Adesanya moving out of the way, dancing around, really doing a good job. And maybe there's a chance that he ends up having a fight where he's just there. Every time that Costa's not, Adesanya is there. He's hitting him with counters. And people might say at the end of the night, well, geez, that was a boring fight because you had one guy that looked like he wanted to engage and one guy that might not have. But I certainly see this the way of the champion. I think we're going to get an and still. Somebody's O has to go. I'm going to keep talking cliches. It's Paulo Costa's. But I think Adesanya keeps his belt here.
I'm going to agree with you. I do think Adesanya and still. But I don't see this being a boring fight. I thought that, yes, the Yoel Romero fight was awful, but I think that's such an outlier because, Yoel will play kind of that game. He'll do what no one thinks he will because it's kind of against the grain and because it's hard to call out Yoel Romero for not being active when he's kind of known for being in crazy fight after crazy fight. So you can't be too hard on the Adesanya Romero fight. It's hard for me to pick against Adesanya at this stage in his career. I think this is going to be the fight of the night, though, and I do think he's going to be able to get it done. I'll even go as far to say he's going to win by stoppage. I know he's not a huge power puncher by any means, but I just think Costa, he leaves those openings available for a high-level guy like Adesanya to crack him. So I think Adesanya's going to be able to get it done. Phenomenal fight.
I'm really looking forward to this fight. We're both going with Israel Adesanya to get the win. It's a good card. It's a sneaky card. There's fights on here that name value wise might not be the best in the world, but I think you're really going to enjoy it. So if you didn't get a chance to check out the playlist, go back through. We've got an extended look at Reyes and Blachowicz. We've got great previews in terms of some of those undercard fights. I'm really looking forward to Brad Riddell and Aleksa Silva. There's a lot of really good ones on there. So keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks. Enjoy the week, enjoy the fights, and make sure you check out Question Mark Kicks, because after weigh-ins, I get the chance to one-up Matt, but we go through the entire card top to bottom. Maybe something funky happened. Maybe we have fights pop in and out. Make sure you check that one out. And Matt, as we always say with Fight Night Picks, let's get into it.